Hello and welcome to this delightful, clean, historical Western romance by Shelfie audiobook. We're thrilled to have you join us. Before we dive in, please take a moment to hit the subscribe button, give this audiobook a thumbs up, and share it with your friends. Your support in these small ways helps us bring you more heartwarming romance stories at no cost. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let yourself be swept away into a world of adventure, love, and unforgettable characters. Enjoy! This audiobook is copyrighted by Shelfie Bennett. Chapter 1: Inheritance of Dust. The auctioneer's gavel fell with a crack that echoed through the near-empty parlor of the Hargrove townhouse, each strike hammering another nail into the coffin of Eliza's former life. She stood rigid by the marble fireplace, her spine straight as a fence post, despite the crushing weight pressing down on her shoulders. The heavy drapes had been drawn back, allowing weak April sunlight to illuminate dust motes dancing above the oriental carpet, the very one being sold at this moment to Mrs. Evelyn Whitcomb, who dined in this room a dozen times and now couldn't quite meet Eliza's gaze. "Sold to Mrs. Whitcomb for $140, the auctioneer announced, his tone as mechanical as the grandfather clock being dismantled in the foyer. "Next item, lot 23, silver tea service, Sheffield manufacturer, 1858. Eliza turned away as Mrs. Whitcomb's maid scurried forward to arrange transportation of the carpet. 3 months ago, Mrs. Whitcomb had squeezed Eliza's hands and called her the daughter I never had. Now she was just another vulture picking at the bones of the Hargrove legacy. "Miss Hargrove?" Eliza composed her features before turning to face Mr. Daniels, her father's. No, her banker. Former banker. "The proceedings should conclude by 4 o'clock, he said, his jowls quivering with what might have been sympathy on a man with more backbone. "I've arranged for the final accounting to be completed by tomorrow morning." "How very efficient of you," Eliza replied, keeping her voice as cool and crisp as fresh linen. "And what precisely will remain after the creditors have taken their due?" Mr. Daniels cleared his throat, eyes darting to his polished shoes. "After settling your father's obligations and accounting for the auction proceeds." He hesitated. "I'm afraid only enough for a modest lodging for perhaps 2 months. Unless, of course, you've reconsidered Mrs. Stanhope's offer." Eliza's spine stiffened further. Mrs. Stanhope, her mother's cousin, had generously offered Eliza a position in her household as companion to her aging mother, with duties suspiciously similar to those of a servant, but without the dignity of wages. "I have not reconsidered. Miss Hargrove, in your position—" "My position, Mr. Daniels, is perfectly clear to me." She softened her tone, seeing genuine concern beneath his discomfort. "I appreciate your assistance during this transition." Mr. Daniels nodded, relieved to escape further conversation, and drifted back toward the cluster of Bostonians examining her mother's china with calculating eyes. Eliza slipped from the parlor into the relative sanctuary of her father's study, the one room not yet picked apart by strangers. Tomorrow it, too, would be emptied. The mahogany desk and leather-bound books scattered to the winds like the Hargrove fortune, the Hargrove reputation, the Hargrove future. She ran her fingertips across the desk's worn surface, remembering sitting on her father's knee as a child while he explained complicated business matters as though she were his son rather than his daughter. George Hargrove had been a progressive man in some ways, even if he'd proven a coward at the end. "Not even a note," she whispered to the empty room. "Not even a goodbye." The door creaked open behind her, and Eliza hastily brushed at her eyes. "Excuse me, Miss Hargrove." It was Millicent, the last of their household staff, who'd stayed until the bitter end out of loyalty rather than expectation of payment. "There's a gentleman to see you. A Mr. Graham from Abbott and Winters, attorneys at law." Eliza frowned. "Another creditor?" "He says not, miss. Says it's a matter of inheritance." "Inheritance?" Eliza nearly laughed. "Everyone with anything to leave me stopped acknowledging my existence the moment father's scandal broke. Shall I send him away?" Eliza sighed. "No, show him in. The study seems fitting for one last disappointment." Millicent nodded and disappeared, returning moments later with a lean, spectacled man whose worn suit suggested his practice wasn't among Boston's elite. "Miss Hargrove, thank you for seeing me without appointment." Mr. Graham clutched a battered leather portfolio. I apologize for the timing, but I've only just tracked you down. You found me on my last day as mistress of this house, Mr. Graham, so your timing is either impeccable or terrible, depending on your news. She gestured toward a chair. Please, sit. He perched on the edge of the seat, pushing his spectacles higher on his nose. I represent the estate of your great-uncle, Ezekiel Hargrove. Eluza's brow furrowed. I have no great-uncle. Ezekiel had, I'm afraid. He passed 6 months ago in Arizona territory. Mr. Graham opened his portfolio. Your father had an uncle who left Boston in 1832 following a disagreement with your great-grandfather. He established himself in what was then New Mexico territory, later Arizona. And this long-lost relative has remembered me in his will? Eliza couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. Mr. Graham, if you're attempting some sort of confidence game... No game, Miss Hargrove. He extracted several documents bound with twine. Ezekiel Hargrove died without children, but left a will specifying that his property should pass to his brother's eldest grandchild. That would be you. Property? Eliza repeated faintly. A ranch, Willow Creek, approximately 160 acres near the settlement of Mesquite Springs. He slid a rough map across the desk. It includes a cabin, various outbuildings, and water rights. Eliza stared at the map, a patchwork of lines and boundaries meaningless to her eastern eyes. Arizona territory. That's quite remote, yes. The journey takes approximately 2 weeks by rail and stagecoach. A sound from the doorway startled them both. Eliza looked up to find Philip Crowley, her former fiancé, regarding her with that particular blend of pity and distaste he'd perfected since breaking their engagement 3 weeks earlier. Pardon the interruption, he said, without a trace of sincerity. I've come for the books I lent your father. Eliza swallowed the retort that sprang to her lips. They're on the shelf by the window, Philip. He crossed to retrieve them, pausing when he overheard Mr. Graham mention Arizona. You're not seriously considering such a thing, Eliza? A woman alone in that wilderness? I don't recall asking your opinion, Mr. Crowley, she replied evenly. Philip snorted, tucking the books under his arm. The scandal has clearly affected your judgment. What would you even do with a ranch? You can barely manage a kitchen garden. Perhaps I'll raise cattle, Eliza said, surprising herself with the notion. Or horses. Absurd. You'll be dead within a month if the Indians don't get you first. Mr. Graham cleared his throat. The Apache in that region have maintained peaceful relations with settlers for some years, and Mesquite Springs is a growing community with several respectable families. Philip ignored him, his gaze fixed on Eliza. You should accept your cousin's offer. It's the only sensible option. Something snapped inside Eliza, the last fragile thread holding together the proper Boston lady she'd been raised to be. She rose from her chair, letting the anger she'd suppressed for months fuel her words. Sensible? She advanced toward him, gratified to see him step back. Was it sensible for you to break our engagement the moment my father's business collapsed? Was it sensible for my dearest friends to suddenly have no room at their dinner tables for scandal-tainted Eliza Hargrove? Perhaps I've had quite enough of Boston sensibility. You're becoming hysterical, Philip said, retreating another step. No, I'm becoming honest. For once in my life, I'm saying what I think instead of what's expected. She turned to Mr. Graham, who was watching with undisguised fascination. Mr. Graham, I accept my inheritance. How soon can the papers be drawn up? They're prepared already, Miss Hargrove. I need only your signature. Philip made a disgusted sound and strode from the room without further comment. Eliza felt a weight lift from her shoulders as the door closed behind him. You needn't decide this minute, Mr. Graham said gently. This is a significant change of circumstances. Eliza laughed, the sound startling her with its genuine mirth. Mr. Graham, look around you. Everything I've known is being sold to strangers. My father is dead by his own hand, my mother gone 3 years past. Society has made it abundantly clear I'm no longer welcome. She sat again, meeting his gaze directly. What exactly would you suggest I remain for? He nodded slowly. The West offers many fresh starts, it's true. Then let us proceed, she said, drawing the papers toward her. What must I know about this inheritance? As Mr. Graham explained the particulars, Eliza's mind raced ahead. Arizona, the word itself sounded like an exhalation after too long underwater. Arizona, where no one knew her name or her shame, where she could reinvent herself as something other than a ruined society daughter. "There's one other item," Mr. Graham said, reaching into his pocket. "Your uncle left this specifically for you, though I confess I don't understand its significance." He placed a silver locket in her palm, its surface engraved with an unusual symbol, a flowing pattern reminiscent of water over stone encircled by rays like a sun. "It's beautiful," she murmured, running her thumb over the intricate design. "There was a letter as well, but I'm afraid it was damaged beyond reading during transit. Only your name remained legible." Eliza closed her fingers around the locket. "No matter. We'll consider it a mystery to solve." 2 hours later, signatures affixed and arrangements made, Eliza stood in her bedroom packing the single trunk she was permitted to retain. Mr. Graham had provided funds from her uncle's estate sufficient for travel expenses and initial supplies. Not a fortune, but more than she'd had an hour ago. Millicent appeared at the doorway. "Miss, will you be needing help with your packing?" "Yes, please." Eliza smiled at the maid, who had been more friend than servant these past difficult months. "And I'd like you to have this." She held out a blue silk gown, one of the few fine items she hadn't been forced to sell. Millicent gasped. "Oh no, miss, I couldn't possibly." "You can, and you will. It never suited my coloring anyway." Eliza pressed the garment into Millicent's hands. "Besides, I'm told silk is impractical for ranch life." Millicent's eyes widened. "Ranch life? Miss Eliza, what are you saying?" As Eliza explained her plans, she watched disbelief transform to cautious excitement on Millicent's face. "It sounds ever so adventurous," the maid said, carefully folding the blue silk. "But aren't you afraid?" Eliza considered the question as she tucked her mother's hairbrush into the trunk. "Terrified," she admitted. "But I'm more afraid of what becomes of me if I stay." 3 days later, Eliza Hargrove sat alone in a first-class train compartment, watching Boston recede into the distance with each puff of the locomotive. Her gloved hands clutched the deed to Willow Creek Ranch, and her uncle's locket hung around her neck, hidden beneath her high-necked traveling dress. "Goodbye and good riddance," she whispered, permitting herself one small, unladylike gesture, sticking her tongue out at the disappearing skyline. A middle-aged woman passing in the corridor gasped at the impropriety. Eliza merely smiled and opened the ranching manual Mr. Graham had procured for her. If she was to become a woman of the West, she had considerable learning ahead. The first evening aboard the train brought Eliza to the dining car, where the head waiter hesitated before seating her alone. Perhaps Madame would prefer to wait for her husband or father to join her. "Madame would prefer her supper while it's still hot," Eliza replied with a pleasant smile that didn't reach her eyes. "And Madame is traveling unaccompanied." This earned her a disapproving frown, but a table nonetheless, tucked behind a potted fern as though her solitary female state might contaminate the other diners. She ordered the roast beef, determined to develop heartier tastes than the delicate portions favored by Boston society. "Heading west, miss?" The question came from the gentleman at the adjacent table, a portly businessman whose friendly expression seemed genuine rather than predatory. "Yes, to Arizona territory," she replied, surprising herself with her candor. "Joining family, I presume?" "No, sir. I'm establishing myself there." The man's bushy eyebrows shot upward. "A single woman? In Arizona?" He shook his head. "Mighty dangerous proposition, if you don't mind my saying so." "So I've been told," Eliza said dryly, "yet men venture there alone every day without comment." "Men are," he began, then caught himself with a chuckle. "Well, I was about to say something foolish about men being better equipped for frontier life, but my late wife would have boxed my ears for it. She homesteaded in Minnesota before we met, tougher than any two men put together." He raised his water glass in salute. "I wish you good fortune, miss." "Thank you, sir. That makes precisely one person in my acquaintance." Each day brought new landscapes rolling past her window, first the familiar green hills of New England, then the broad expanses of the Midwest with farms stretching to the horizon. Eliza devoured her ranching manual between bouts of dizziness when she looked up to find the world so vast around her. Cattle breeds, pasture rotation, water management. The terminology swam before her eyes, occasionally interspersed with alarming passages about predators, both animal and human. She dog-eared pages about wells and springs, sensing water would be precious in the arid territory she was approaching. The passengers changed at each major stop, a revolving cast of characters that thinned as they traveled westward. Eliza fielded increasingly direct questions and warnings about her destination. "A woman rancher?" scoffed one silver-hailed matron. "You'll be married or murdered within a fortnight?" "Perhaps I'll marry the murderer and simplify matters," Eliza replied, earning a horrified gasp and blissful silence for the remainder of that leg. Not all encounters were unpleasant. A kind-faced woman traveling to Colorado with her husband offered practical advice about household management without indoor plumbing. A grizzled former cavalryman shared tips for keeping scorpions out of boots. Eliza filled a small notebook with these nuggets of frontier wisdom, determined to prepare herself as thoroughly as possible. By the fifth day, the landscape had transformed dramatically. The lush greens gave way to tans and rusty reds, the rolling hills to flat expanses broken by jagged formations that seemed drawn by a child's unsteady hand. The very air changed when she lowered her window, drier, sharper, carrying scents of sage and dust rather than the damp earthiness of the east. "This is nothing," said the leathery-faced miner who'd joined her compartment in Kansas City. "Wait till you hit real desert country. This here's practically farmland compared." "Is it true there are no trees in Arizona?" Eliza asked, trying to imagine such a place. The miner cackled. "Oh, there's trees all right. Twisted, stubborn things that'll poke your eye out soon as look at you. Not like them eastern trees, all soft and green." He studied her fine traveling costume. "Begging your pardon, miss, but you got proper clothes for Arizona. That getup'll roast you alive come summer." Eliza glanced down at her heavy wool traveling suit. "I plan to purchase appropriate attire at my destination." "Good thinking. Them Eastern catalogs don't know spit about desert living." He scratched his whiskered chin. "Mind a bit of advice from an old desert rat?" "I welcome all guidance, sir. First thing you do, hire yourself a Mexican or Indian woman to show you the ropes. They've been surviving that country longer than any white folk. Learn from 'em before you go making up your mind how things ought to be done." Eliza nodded thoughtfully. "That's excellent counsel, Mr. Higgins. Thank you." "Second thing," he leaned forward, lowering his voice, "get yourself a good pistol and learn to use it, not for people, mind you. For snakes." "Snakes?" Eliza repeated faintly. "Rattlers big as your arm." He gestured from shoulder to wrist. "But they're gentlemen mostly. Give fair warning before they strike, unlike most creatures on two legs." That night, alone in her compartment as the train clattered westward, Eliza pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window. The vast prairie was bathed in moonlight, creating a silvery ocean stretching to the horizon. Stars blazed overhead in configurations she'd never seen in Boston's light-polluted skies. She touched the locket at her throat, wondering what kind of man her great-uncle had been to thrive in such a wilderness. Had he found peace in this expansive emptiness? Freedom? Whatever he'd sought, he'd never returned to Boston, not even to mend the family rift as he lay dying. "What am I doing?" she whispered to the glass, her breath fogging the moonlit view. The doubts she'd suppressed came rushing back. She knew nothing of ranching, nothing of the West, nothing of survival without the comforts and constraints of civilization. She was charging headlong into folly, just as Philip had predicted. Then again, what true choice did she have? Return to Boston and a life of genteel poverty and pitying glances? Become an unpaid servant to a distant relative? At least in Arizona, her failures would be her own. Eliza straightened her shoulders and opened her ranching manual again, turning to the chapter on predator control. If Arizona had rattlesnakes big as your arm, she intended to be prepared. As dawn broke over the plains, Eliza made a solemn vow to herself. She would not merely survive in this new land, she would thrive. Willow Creek Ranch would flourish under her care, becoming a testament to what a woman could accomplish when freed from society's cage. The train whistle shrieked, startling her from her reverie. Through the windows, she saw they were approaching another dusty town. One of dozens they'd passed, each smaller and rougher than the last. But this time, something fluttered in her chest that felt suspiciously like hope. Clutching her deed and touching the hidden locket for reassurance, Eliza Hargrove set her gaze westward, toward a future as wide and untamed as the country unfurling before her. The stagecoach hit another rut, sending Eliza bouncing against the worn leather seat. Her traveling companions, a whiskey drummer, a woman clutching a squalling infant, and an elderly miner who'd slept through what Eliza considered life-threatening jolts, barely seemed to notice. After 2 days of this torture, Eliza had surrendered any pretense of dignity, her once crisp traveling costume wilted in the merciless heat. "First trip west, ma'am?" The drummer grinned, displaying a gold tooth that caught the relentless sunlight streaming through the dusty window. "What gave me away?" Eliza asked, wiping perspiration from her forehead with a handkerchief long past pristine. "You still flinch when we hit the bumps." He chuckled. "Give it another day, you'll be sleeping like old Chester here." He nodded toward the snoring miner. "We arrive in Mesquite Springs today, do we not?" Eliza glanced anxiously out the window at the alien landscape. Nothing in her Boston upbringing had prepared her for terrain so harshly beautiful. Red rocks thrust toward a sky of impossible blue. Skeletal plants with wicked thorns stood sentinel across the parched earth, and heat shimmered in waves that made distant mountains dance like phantoms. "Yep, about an hour, I reckon. Driver will be stopping to water the horses at the last creek before town." The drummer studied her with undisguised curiosity. "If you don't mind my asking, what brings a lady like yourself to a place like Mesquite Springs? Not exactly a tourist destination." "I've inherited property there," Eliza replied, deciding honesty required less energy than invention in this heat. "A ranch called Willow Creek." The effect of her words was instantaneous. The woman with the baby looked up sharply, and even old Chester's snoring hitched. "You're Hargrove's heir?" the drummer asked, eyebrows climbing toward his hairline. Eliza's fingers instinctively found the locket hidden beneath her collar. "You knew my uncle?" Everybody knew Ezekiel Hargrove. The woman spoke for the first time, her voice carrying a soft accent Eliza couldn't place. "Man kept to himself mostly, but fair in his dealings. Stubborn as a 3-legged mule," the drummer added with a laugh. "Begging your pardon, ma'am." "I'll take that as a family compliment, Mr. Jackson. Thaddeus Jackson at your service." He tipped his hat. "I sell the finest Kentucky bourbon this side of the Mississippi. Your uncle was a steady customer. For medicinal purposes only, of course." He winked. "Of course." Eliza found herself smiling despite her exhaustion. "You planning to work that ranch yourself?" the woman asked, skepticism evident in her tone as she assessed Eliza's city attire. Before Eliza could answer, the stagecoach lurched to a stop, followed by the driver's shout, "10 minutes! Stretch your legs while we water the team!" Eliza nearly wept with relief as she accepted Jackson's help down from the coach. Her legs trembled beneath her, cramped from hours of sitting. The creek promised by the drummer proved to be little more than a trickle between sun-baked rocks, but the cottonwood trees surrounding it offered blessed shade. "Droughts hit hard this year," Jackson commented, noting her disappointed expression. "This creek used to run knee-deep even in summer." "How long has the drought lasted?" Eliza asked, thinking of the ranching manual's dire warnings about water management. "Going on 18 months with barely a drop." The woman had joined them, bouncing her now quiet infant. "I'm Maria Rodriguez, by the way. My husband has a small farm outside Mesquite Springs." "Pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Rodriguez." Eliza hesitated before asking, "Did you happen to know if my uncle's ranch has a reliable water source?" An odd look passed between Jackson and Mrs. Rodriguez. "Your uncle's place has water," Jackson said carefully. "That's what makes it interesting." Before Eliza could press further, the driver called them back to the coach. The final hour passed in a haze of heat and dust, the road deteriorating to little more than a pair of wheel ruts through scrubland. Finally, they crested a rise, and Mesquite Springs came into view below. Eliza's heart sank. The growing community Mr. Graham had described consisted of perhaps 24 buildings strung along a single dusty street. Even from a distance, the town had a parched, desperate quality, like a man too long without water. "Welcome to civilization," Jackson said with a wry smile, noting her expression. The stagecoach rattled down the main street, passing a general store, a blacksmith shop belching smoke, something that might generously be called a church, and an establishment proudly proclaiming itself the Silver Spur Saloon in faded lettering. A few horses stood hip-shot at hitching posts, and fewer people moved along the boardwalks, seeking refuge from the punishing afternoon sun. They lurched to a stop before a two-story structure with Mesquite Springs Hotel painted across its facade. Compared to the surrounding buildings, it appeared almost prosperous. "End of the line," the driver called, already untying Eliza's trunk. Jackson helped her down once more. "Miss Hargrove, it was a pleasure. If you need anything at all, I make my rounds through here every month." "Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Jackson." Eliza straightened her skirts, acutely aware of the dust coating every inch of her person. Mrs. Rodriguez touched her arm. "My husband and I live 3 miles west. If you need help at your ranch—" She hesitated. "Ezekiel was good to us when others weren't." With that cryptic remark, she and the drummer went their separate ways, leaving Eliza alone before the hotel as the stagecoach lumbered toward the livery stable. For a moment, she stood frozen, the enormity of her decision crashing down upon her. 2 weeks ago, she'd been in Boston, surrounded by familiar sights and sounds. Now she stood in an alien world where even the air felt different in her lungs. "You can do this," she whispered to herself, squaring her shoulders before climbing the steps to the hotel. The interior was mercifully cooler, though the dim light after the brilliant sunshine left her momentarily blind. As her eyes adjusted, she made out a small lobby with worn but clean furniture. A desk occupied one wall, behind which a thin man with spectacles looked up from a ledger. "Afternoon, ma'am. Room for the night?" "Yes, please." Eliza moved toward the desk, her legs still unsteady from the journey. "My name is Eliza Hargrove," he finished for her, eyes brightening with interest. "From Boston." Eliza blinked in surprise. "How did you—" "Small towns run on gossip, Miss Hargrove," he offered a friendly smile. "Word of Ezekiel's heir coming to claim Willow Creek's been our main topic of conversation for weeks. I'm Danielle Webster. No relation to the statesman, much to my father's disappointment. This is my establishment." "It's very charming," Eliza managed, mustering every ounce of her Boston politeness. Webster laughed. "It's a far cry from what you're used to, I imagine. But the sheets are clean and the roof doesn't leak. Much." He slid a register toward her. "I expect you'll want to rest before meeting with Mr. Harrison about transportation to your property tomorrow." "Mr. Harrison?" "Town's only lawyer. He's been overseeing Willow Creek since your uncle passed." Webster lowered his voice. "Between us, I'd get out there sooner rather than later." "There's been talk." Eliza signed the register, her fatigue momentarily forgotten. "What kind of talk?" Webster hesitated, glancing toward the lobby, where 2 men in dusty range clothes were seated, apparently absorbed in a game of checkers. "Nothing to concern yourself with today," he said a bit too heartily. "Room 3, top of the stairs. Bathhouse is out back if you'd like to freshen up. Dinner served at 6 in the dining room." Eliza recognized a closed subject when she heard one. "Thank you, Mr. Webster. I would appreciate it if you could send word to Mr. Harrison that I'd like to meet him as soon as possible." "Already done, Ms. Hargrove," Webster smiled. "Like I said, small town." "In her room?" "Small, but as promised, clean." Eliza sank onto the narrow bed, every muscle protesting. Her trunk would be brought up later, Webster had assured her, but for now, she had only her carpet bag containing immediate necessities. She extracted her hairbrush and stood before the spotted mirror, wincing at her reflection. Her chestnut hair had escaped its pins. Her complexion was alarmingly flushed from sun exposure, and dust seemed to have worked its way into every pore. "You look like you've been dragged behind the stagecoach rather than riding in it," she told her reflection, attempting to restore order to her appearance. Her ablutions complete, Eliza found herself too restless to nap, despite her exhaustion. The muffled voices from downstairs drew her curiosity, and she made her way back to the lobby, pausing on the staircase when she heard her name. "Hargrove's niece won't last a week," one of the checker players was saying. "Eastern women ain't built for this country." "She's his great niece, Earl, and you ain't even seen her yet," his companion replied. "Besides, Montgomery'll probably convince her to sell before she sets foot on the property." "That water under Hargrove land's worth more than gold right now," Earl declared. "Montgomery knows it too. been trying to get his hands on that spring since before Ezekiel took sick? Eliza frowned. Spring? The ranching manual had emphasized water rights as critical, but neither Mr. Graham nor her fellow passengers had mentioned a spring specifically. She continued down the stairs, deliberately making her footfalls audible. The men glanced up, then quickly returned to their game, suddenly fascinated by the checkerboard. Webster emerged from a back room. "Miss Hargrove, I was about to send up some tea if you'd like." "That would be lovely, thank you." She nodded politely to the checker players, who mumbled greetings without meeting her gaze. The tea, when it arrived, was weak but blissfully cool. Eliza sipped it in a chair near the lobby's single window, watching the quiet street outside while considering what she'd overheard. A valuable spring on Willow Creek would explain why her inheritance might attract interest. But who was Montgomery? And why would he expect her to sell immediately? The hotel door swung open, momentarily flooding the dim lobby with harsh light. In the doorway stood a man whose very presence seemed to alter the atmosphere of the room. Tall and broad-shouldered, he wore a black suit that, despite the dust of the street, retained an air of expensive tailoring. His features were handsome in a severe way. Sharp cheekbones, strong jaw, darkened with the shadow of a beard despite the early hour, and eyes the pale blue of winter ice. "Ms. Hargrove, I presume?" His voice matched his appearance, cultured but with an edge that raised the hairs on Eliza's neck. She set down her teacup. "You have the advantage of me, sir." "James Montgomery." He removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with silver at the temples, and crossed to her with the confidence of a man accustomed to commanding any room he entered. "I own the Circle and I were neighbors, of a sort." The checker players had abandoned all pretense of their game, watching the exchange with undisguised interest. "A pleasure to meet you, Mr. Montgomery." Eliza maintained the cool politeness that had been her armor in Boston society. "I understand you knew my uncle well?" A smile curved his lips without reaching those ice-blue eyes. "Ezekiel was a character. Independent to the end." He settled into the chair opposite her without waiting for an invitation. "I was sorry to hear of his passing." "You're very kind, though I confess I never had the opportunity to know him myself." "Which makes your decision to claim his property all the more interesting." Montgomery leaned forward slightly. "Willow Creek is challenging land, Miss Hargrove. Not at all suitable for a woman of your obvious refinement." Eliza raised an eyebrow. "How fortunate that my refinement is not required to assess the property's value." A flicker of surprise crossed his face before he laughed, a sound of genuine amusement that transformed his features from merely handsome to momentarily magnetic. "Direct, like your uncle," he nodded approvingly. "Then allow me to be equally direct. I'd like to purchase Willow Creek from you. I'll offer $5,000, a generous sum given its condition, and more than enough to establish you comfortably back east." $5,000 was indeed a small fortune, far more than she'd expected the property to be worth, especially sight unseen. The very generosity of the offer raised Eliza's suspicions. "That's a remarkable proposal, Mr. Montgomery, particularly as you haven't inquired whether I intend to sell." "Don't you?" His gaze was penetrating. "A young, unmarried woman of quality, alone in a frontier town? Surely you don't intend to become a rancher." "And if I do?" Montgomery's smile tightened. "Then I admire your spirit, if not your judgment. Ranching requires experience, Miss Hargrove. Physical strength, knowledge of the land." He gestured toward the parched vista visible through the window. "This country breaks men regularly. What do you imagine it will do to you?" Eliza felt heat rise in her cheeks but kept her voice level. "I imagine it will teach me a great deal, Mr. Montgomery. Lessons I am willing to learn." "At what cost?" "At whatever cost is necessary." She met his gaze steadily. "I appreciate your concern, but I have no intention of selling Willow Creek without at least seeing it first." Montgomery studied her for a long moment, then inclined his head slightly. "As you wish. When you're ready to reconsider, and you will be, my offer stands." He rose, settling his hat back on his head. "A word of advice, Miss Hargrove? Trust is a luxury in these parts. Extend it sparingly." With that, he strode from the hotel, leaving behind a curious silence. The checker players exchanged glances, then hurriedly returned to their game when Eliza looked their way. "Well, Webster said from behind the desk. That was lively. Eliza released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Does Mr. Montgomery often make business propositions to women he's just met? Only the ones sitting on something he wants. Webster's candor surprised her. Don't misunderstand. James Montgomery is a powerful man in this county. Built the Circle M from nothing after the war. But Ezekiel was the one thorn in his side he could never remove. Because of the spring? Webster's eyebrows rose. You know about that already? I overheard mentions. She gestured toward the checker players who had the grace to look abashed. Is that why my uncle's land is valuable? A water source during drought? Partly. Webster seemed about to say more when the door opened again, admitting a slight, balding man in a suit almost as dusty as Eliza's own. Ah, Mr. Harrison, perfect timing. Harrison crossed to Eliza, extending a hand. Miss Hargrove, a pleasure. I understand you wish to visit your property as soon as possible? Yes, please, tomorrow morning if it can be arranged. I can escort you myself, Harrison offered. I've been overseeing basic maintenance, though I fear the place has suffered some neglect these past months. I'd appreciate that greatly, Eliza said, relief washing through her. At least she wouldn't arrive completely alone. Settled, then. I'll meet you here at 7. The ride takes about 2 hours. Harrison glanced toward the street, where Montgomery's tall figure was still visible, walking toward the saloon. I see you've met our local cattle baron. Indeed. He made quite a generous offer for property he describes as challenging. Harrison's lips thinned. Did he now? Well, don't make any decisions until you've seen Willow Creek for yourself. Ezekiel had his reasons for specifically naming you in his will. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of fatigue. Eliza forced herself to eat a surprisingly palatable dinner in the hotel's small dining room, conscious of curious stares from the few other patrons. She retired early, lying awake in the unfamiliar bed while her mind raced with questions. What made her uncle's land so valuable that Montgomery would offer thousands sight unseen? What was the significance of the spring mentioned by Earl? And why had Uncle Ezekiel left his property to a great niece he'd never met? Sleep claimed her eventually, and morning arrived with a clarity of light that seemed to sharpen the edges of everything. Harrison was punctual, waiting in the lobby with a buckboard hitched to 2 sturdy mules. Eliza emerged in her most practical traveling outfit, still woefully inappropriate for the climate, she realized, as the sun beat down mercilessly. Ready for your first look at Willow Creek? Harrison asked, helping her onto the hard wooden seat. More than ready, Eliza replied, securing her hat against the dust their departure would inevitably raise. The journey took them through the sere landscape Eliza had glimpsed from the stagecoach, but at a pace that allowed her to truly absorb her surroundings. What had initially seemed barren revealed itself as teeming with life, adapted to harsh conditions. Birds soaring on thermals, lizards darting between rocks, and plants whose subtle greens contrasted with the ruddy earth. It's beautiful in its way, she murmured almost to herself. Harrison glanced at her with new respect. Most Easterners only see what's missing. The forests, the meadows. They never learn to appreciate what's actually here. My uncle did, it seems. Ezekiel understood this country better than most born to it. Harrison pointed toward a distant ridge. Your property begins there. Willow Creek crosses the northeast corner, though it's barely a trickle this summer. As they approached, Eliza's heart quickened. This was her land, her fresh start, her chance to build something of her own. The practical part of her mind cataloged what she could see: rolling terrain with scattered vegetation, more abundant in some areas than others, a few stands of trees marking what must be water courses, and in the distance, what appeared to be structures. The main house and outbuildings are just ahead, Harrison said, following her gaze. Not much to look at, I'm afraid. Ezekiel was more concerned with function than appearance. Eliza hadn't known what to expect, but the reality of Willow Creek Ranch still hit her like a physical blow as they drew closer. The main house was a low cabin constructed of logs and adobe, its roof sagging slightly at one corner. Nearby stood a barn in similar condition, a chicken coop missing half its wire, and a corral with several broken rails. The only vibrant note in the scene was a large cottonwood tree shading one side of the cabin, its leaves whispering in the slight breeze. "Oh," she said softly. Harrison misinterpreted her reaction. "It's rough, I know, but structurally sound. Ezekiel built to last." Eliza swallowed her disappointment. "It has potential." "That it does." Harrison stopped the buckboard before the cabin. "Especially with the right steward." The interior of the cabin was simpler still. 2 rooms, one serving as both kitchen and living area, the other as bedroom. A cast-iron stove dominated one wall, opposite shelves laden with mismatched dishes and cooking implements. A heavy oak table with 4 chairs stood in the center, its surface scarred from years of use. "Your uncle's desk," Harrison said, indicating a rolled-top secretary against the far wall. "His personal papers remain inside. I didn't feel it my place to go through them beyond what was necessary for the estate." Eliza nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The cabin smelled of dust and abandonment, yet beneath those scents lingered others. Coffee, tobacco, the ghosts of meals cooked long ago. The windows were small but surprisingly well placed, allowing cross-ventilation that kept the interior cooler than she'd expected. Someone had laid in a supply of firewood and filled a water bucket. Harrison's doing, she assumed. "I'll check the outbuildings while you get your bearings," he offered tactfully, seeming to sense her need for a moment alone. When the door closed behind him, Eliza sank into one of the oak chairs, pressed her palms flat against the table, and allowed herself 3 deep breaths. This was harder than she'd imagined. Not just the primitive conditions, but the weight of stepping into a stranger's life, a life that had ended with her name on a will and a locket around her neck. "What am I doing here?" she whispered to the empty room. No answer came, of course, but the sound of her own voice steadied her. This was her choice, her chance. Rising, she moved to the desk, running her fingers over its worn surface before sitting in the creaking chair before it. The roll-top was unlocked, revealing cubbyholes stuffed with papers, receipts, letters, and leather-bound journals. Eliza hesitated, feeling like an intruder despite her legal rights to these possessions. Then she straightened her shoulders and began to explore, starting with the most recent journal. Her uncle's handwriting was surprisingly elegant for a frontier rancher. Slanted and precise, filling pages with observations about weather, livestock, and cryptic references to the source that made little sense to her. A notation from 3 months before his death caught her eye. "Boston inquiry sent. If blood means anything, she'll understand the trust." Eliza stared at the words. She? Could he have meant her? But how could her uncle have known anything about her character? She set the journal aside and continued exploring the desk's contents. In the largest drawer, she found land deeds, tax receipts, and a formal-looking document written in Spanish that she couldn't decipher. The smaller drawers contained the mundane detritus of daily life: pencil stubs, buttons, twine, a pipe still fragrant with tobacco. It was while closing the bottom drawer that she noticed the inconsistency. The interior depth was several inches less than the exterior dimensions would suggest. Eliza ran her fingers along the drawer bottom, finding a slight gap at the back edge. When she pressed, something clicked, and a false bottom popped upward. Within the hidden compartment lay a leather-bound folder and a small key. Hands trembling slightly, Eliza withdrew the folder and untied its binding. Inside were several maps, each showing Willow Creek Ranch from a different perspective. The most detailed depicted the property's topography with meticulous care, but what drew her eye was a familiar symbol inked near the center. The exact pattern engraved on her locket. "The source," she murmured, suddenly understanding the journal references. The symbol marked what could only be a spring, the water source Montgomery and the townspeople had mentioned, located deep within her property. The sound of boots on the porch alerted her to Harrison's return. Hurriedly, she slipped the maps back into the folder and returned everything to the hidden compartment, securing it just as the door opened. "Outbuildings need work, but nothing fatal," Harrison reported. "Seems some local boys have been helping themselves to materials while the place stood empty." He paused, studying her face. "Are you all right, Miss Hargrove?" "Yes, thank you." Eliza composed herself. Just absorbing it all. Harrison nodded sympathetically. It's a lot to take in. I've taken the liberty of arranging for supplies to be delivered tomorrow. Basics to get you through the first week. After that, he spread his hands. Well, it's entirely up to you what happens to Willow Creek Ranch. Mr. Harrison, why would Mr. Montgomery offer $5,000 for this property? Eliza asked bluntly. As you can see, the structures alone aren't worth nearly that amount. Harrison looked uncomfortable. That's a complicated question, Miss Hargrove. I find simple answers work best for complicated questions. That earned her a reluctant smile. Montgomery controls most of the grazing land in the county. Willow Creek is a missing piece in his kingdom, you might say. Because of the spring, Harrison hesitated. Partly, but there's more to it than that. Your uncle and Montgomery had a history. Not a pleasant one. For Montgomery, buying this land would be a victory of sorts. Eliza sensed she wouldn't get a more direct answer, at least not today. I see. And how soon can I expect those supplies you mentioned? By noon tomorrow. I've also engaged a local woman, Mrs. Sanchez, to help you get settled. She worked for your uncle occasionally and knows the place. Relief washed through her. That's very thoughtful, thank you. Will you be returning to town with me today, or... The question hung in the air. Eliza looked around the cabin, dusty, primitive, utterly foreign to her experience. The sensible choice would be to return to the relative comfort of the hotel while she considered her options. But something, stubbornness perhaps, or the need to prove herself, made her decision clear. I'll stay, she said. This is my home now, after all. Harrison looked surprised, but nodded. As you wish. I've left a rifle by the door. Do you know how to use one? No, but I expect I'll learn along with many other things. After reviewing practical matters, where to find water, how to operate the stove, which neighbors might be called upon in an emergency, Harrison reluctantly took his leave, promising to return in 3 days to check on her progress. Eliza stood in the doorway watching the buckboard disappear over the ridge, acutely aware that for the first time in her life, she was truly alone. The afternoon passed in a flurry of activity as she explored every corner of her new home, taking inventory of her meager possessions and making mental lists of necessities. The cabin was primitive but sound, with fewer vermin than she'd feared. The lands around it showed evidence of careful management. Irrigation ditches, though dry, had been well maintained. Fence lines, while needing repair, followed terrain contours with logical precision. As the day's heat began to wane, Eliza found herself drawn to the porch steps, watching the setting sun transform the landscape into a painter's dream of golds, ochres, and deep purples. The vast emptiness that had seemed so intimidating now felt almost peaceful, the silence broken only by unfamiliar bird calls and the whisper of wind through the cottonwood. She touched the locket at her throat, thinking of the maps hidden in the desk. Tomorrow she would begin exploring her land properly, perhaps even search for the spring marked by the mysterious symbol. But tonight she would allow herself this moment of quiet contemplation, this acknowledgement of the enormity of the change she'd embraced. Movement on a distant ridge caught her eye, a rider silhouetted against the sunset, horse and human merging into a single dark shape. Even at this distance, Eliza could feel the weight of observation. Someone was watching Willow Creek Ranch. Watching her. She stood, shading her eyes against the sinking sun, but the figure had already wheeled around and was galloping away, disappearing into the gathering dusk. Eliza remained on the porch as darkness enveloped her new home, the stars emerging overhead in numbers that stole her breath. The night air carried scents of sage and dust and possibilities. In Boston, she had been Eliza Hargrove, ruined daughter of a disgraced man. Here, she could be anyone. Or rather, she could become herself, unfettered by society's constraints and expectations. Thank you, Uncle Ezekiel, she whispered to the star-filled sky, her hand closing around the locket with its water-over-stone symbol. I won't waste this chance. Tomorrow would bring challenges enough. For tonight, she allowed herself to believe that the mysterious rider had been a welcome rather than a warning. the land itself acknowledging its new steward had arrived at last. Chapter 2: Water and Dust. Eliza woke to the unfamiliar sound of a rooster crowing. For one disoriented moment, she reached for the bell pull to summon Millicent. Then, reality rushed in as her hand encountered the rough-hewn wall of her uncle's cabin. No, her cabin now. She blinked at the ceiling, watching dust motes dance in the shaft of sunlight piercing through the small window. So, it wasn't a dream after all, she murmured, pushing aside the threadbare quilt. The floor was cool beneath her bare feet as she crossed to the window. Dawn had barely broken, painting the landscape in gentle pinks and golds that softened its harsh contours. In Boston, she would still be abed at this hour, but something about the pristine morning beckoned her outside. Splashing water on her face from the basin, Eliza dressed quickly in her plainest traveling skirt and shirtwaist, already planning modifications to make the garments more practical for ranch life. Her single concession to vanity was pinning her chestnut hair into a simple knot at her nape and fastening Uncle Ezekiel's locket around her throat. The cabin door squeaked in protest as she pushed it open. One more item for her growing mental list of repairs. She stopped short on the threshold, staring at the porch in disbelief. A wooden crate sat beside the door, laden with provisions. A sack of coffee beans, salt pork wrapped in butcher's paper, a small sack of flour, 3 fresh apples, a jar of honey, and beneath it all, a loaf of bread, still warm to the touch. Beside the crate stood a covered pail of fresh milk with cream already rising to the top. "Hello?" Eliza called, scanning the surrounding area for her benefactor. Nothing moved except a jackrabbit darting between clumps of sagebrush. She searched the porch for a note, finding none. "Peculiar," she muttered, carrying the unexpected bounty inside. Her stomach growled as she sliced the bread, reminding her she'd eaten nothing since the previous noon. Whoever had left these supplies had saved her from a hungry morning. Despite Mr. Harrison's assurance that more provisions would arrive by midday, she'd been facing the prospect of a breakfast consisting solely of water and determination. The coffee proved more challenging than anticipated. In Boston, preparing coffee had been the kitchen staff's responsibility. After several fumbling attempts with the stove and coffee pot, she managed to produce a brew so potent it made her eyes water at the first sip. Still, the bitter liquid combined with honey-sweetened bread felt like a triumph. Her first meal in her own home. Not bad for a beginning, she told the empty room, oddly pleased with herself. Now to work. The ranching manual she'd studied on the journey west emphasized the importance of a daily inspection of one's property. With the hidden maps fresh in her mind, Eliza was particularly eager to locate the spring marked with her locket's symbol. First, however, she needed to become better acquainted with the immediate surroundings. Armed with determination and a sunbonnet woefully inadequate for the Arizona sun, she set out to survey the ranch building. The chicken coop, she discovered, actually housed 3 bedraggled hens who regarded her suspiciously from their roosts. The barn contained ancient tack hanging from pegs, tools in various states of repair, and a surprising collection of books stacked in one corner, further evidence of her uncle's unexpected scholarly inclinations. It was the broken corral that first tempted her to practical labor. Several rails had come loose, their supporting posts leaning at precarious angles. The ranching manual had been quite specific about the importance of secure enclosures. How difficult can it be? Eliza mused aloud, eyeing a hammer and bucket of nails she'd spotted in the barn. 2 hours and several smashed fingers later, she had her answer. The desert sun beat down mercilessly as she struggled with the unwieldy rails, her skirts catching on splinters, her hands developing blisters despite her determined efforts. What had seemed a simple task in theory proved maddeningly complicated in practice. Confounded, stubborn piece of... She bit back the unladylike expletive as the rail she'd been forcing into position slipped from her grasp, narrowly missing her foot. "My uncle made this look so easy in his journal descriptions," she grumbled, wiping perspiration from her forehead with her sleeve. Her throat felt parched despite frequent trips to the water bucket, and her sunbonnet had long since abandoned its post, hanging down her back by its ribbons. The well pump presented an even greater challenge. Located behind the cabin, the iron handle required strength she didn't possess to produce more than a trickle of water. After several fruitless attempts left her arms trembling with exertion, Eliza sat on the edge of the stone well housing, close to tears of frustration. "There must be a trick to it," she told a lizard watching her with apparent fascination from a nearby rock. "Perhaps I should wait for Mrs. Sanchez to show me." The lizard flicked its tongue as if in agreement, then skittered away at the sound of approaching horses. Eliza rose quickly, shading her eyes against the glare as 3 riders approached from the direction of the main road. The men wore the dust-coated garb of working cowboys, but something in their posture set her nerves on edge. She smoothed her rumpled skirt and attempted to pin loose tendrils of hair back into place, determined to present a dignified front despite her disheveled state. The riders drew rein before the cabin, surveying her with undisguised curiosity. "Afternoon, ma'am," the foremost rider called, touching the brim of his hat. He was a weathered man of middle years with a scar bisecting one eyebrow. "Jed Wilson, foreman at the Circle M. Mr. Montgomery asked us to check how you're settling in." Eliza doubted very much that concern for her welfare had motivated the visit, but she maintained her composure. "How thoughtful of Mr. Montgomery. As you can see, I'm managing quite well." Wilson's gaze flicked to her blistered hands and the failed corral repairs behind her, one corner of his mouth quirking upward. "Yes, ma'am, I can see that." The younger cowboy to his right snickered, quickly smothering the sound when Wilson shot him a look. "Mr. Montgomery wanted us to remind you his offer stands," Wilson continued. $5,000 is mighty generous for a spread this size." "I've scarcely had time to evaluate my property, Mr. Wilson." Eliza lifted her chin. "It would be premature to consider selling." The third rider, silent until now, shifted in his saddle. "Mighty dangerous for a woman alone out here. Wolves, coyotes, rattlesnakes." He paused meaningfully. "All sorts of predators about." "Is that a warning or a threat, sir?" Eliza asked, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Wilson intervened smoothly. "Just stating facts, ma'am. Arizona territory ain't Boston." "I'm becoming increasingly aware of that, thank you." She folded her raw hands before her. "Please convey my regards to Mr. Montgomery and assure him I'll notify him should I decide to sell, which I won't." Wilson considered her for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "As you say, ma'am." "Boys, let's ride." They wheeled their horses around, but the youngest rider paused, looking back over his shoulder. "That spring of yours being worth more than gold in these parts," he called, "especially with the drought. Shame if anything happened to it." "That's enough, Pete," Wilson snapped, but the message had been delivered. Eliza remained rigid until the riders disappeared over the rise, then sagged against the cabin wall, heart pounding. The encounter confirmed her suspicions about the spring's importance, and Montgomery's determination to acquire it. Whatever her uncle had protected here, it clearly went beyond mere water rights. "I need to find that spring," she murmured, her gaze drifting to the ridge where she'd seen the lone rider the previous evening. Had that been one of Montgomery's men as well? The thought sent a chill through her despite the heat. Returning to the cabin, she retrieved the maps from their hiding place and spread them on the oak table. The most detailed showed topographical features with the water symbol identical to her locket, located perhaps 2 miles northeast of the cabin. The terrain appeared challenging, with several ravines and a ridge between her current position and the marked location. Eliza hesitated, considering the wisdom of venturing out alone after her visitor's veiled threats. But waiting meant remaining ignorant of her property's most valuable asset, and ignorance was a luxury she couldn't afford. Decision made, she filled a canteen with the meager water she'd managed to pump, packed the remaining bread and an apple in a small cloth, and tucked the map into her pocket. "I'll be back before dusk," she promised the dilapidated cabin, as if it might worry in her absence. The first mile passed pleasantly enough. The morning's brutal heat had given way to a more forgiving afternoon as clouds gathered over distant mountains. Following a faint trail that roughly aligned with her map, Eliza found herself enjoying the solitude and the surprising beauty of the desert landscape. Wildflowers she couldn't name clustered in protected hollows, and twice she startled jackrabbits from their resting places. Her uncle's journal had mentioned landmarks Split Rock, the lightning tree, that she now matched to actual features with growing confidence. The journal had not, however, mentioned how quickly the terrain could change, nor how easily one trail could be mistaken for another. By the second hour, Eliza had lost the path entirely. The clouds had thickened, casting the landscape in deceptive shadow that made reading the map increasingly difficult. Without the sun's position to orient herself, each ravine began to look identical to the last. Her water was half gone, and her feet, unused to such exertion, throbbed painfully inside her impractical leather boots. "You're not lost," she told herself firmly. "You're exploring your own property. There's a difference." The difference felt semantic as the afternoon wore on. What had seemed a straightforward journey on paper proved bewildering in reality. The locket at her throat felt suddenly heavy, as if mocking her confidence. When she stumbled on a loose rock and nearly fell, Eliza was forced to acknowledge her predicament. She was lost. The water in her canteen had grown tepid and tasted of metal. Her head had begun to ache from squinting against the glare, and her skin felt tight and hot despite the cloud cover. Consulting the map once more, she tried to match the contour lines to the ridges surrounding her, but the features swam before her eyes. "Uncle Ezekiel," she muttered. "You might have left more detailed directions alongside your mysterious maps." Deciding that higher ground might offer better perspective, Eliza began climbing the nearest ridge. Each step required more effort than the last, her skirts catching on rocks and brush. Halfway up, dizziness forced her to pause, leaning against a boulder while the landscape tilted alarmingly around her. "Just a moment's rest," she gasped, sliding down to sit with her back against the sun-heated stone. The distant thunder barely registered through her throbbing headache. Even the water from her canteen failed to ease the growing disorientation. Had the sun always been this bright, even through clouds? Had breathing always required such deliberate effort? "Fool, woman!" The growled words seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Eliza forced her eyes open. When had she closed them? To find a figure looming over her, backlit by the darkening sky so that his features remained in shadow. "I'm not," she began, but her tongue felt thick and uncooperative. Rough hands gripped her shoulders, tilting her forward. A canteen pressed against her lips, the water within cool and sweet compared to her own tepid supply. She drank greedily until it was pulled away. "Slowly," the voice commanded, gruff but not unkind. "Heat sickness, too much too fast will make you ill." As her vision cleared, Eliza found herself staring into the most striking pair of eyes she'd ever encountered. An unusual shade of amber flecked with gold, set in a face weathered by sun and hardship. A jagged scar ran from the man's left temple to the corner of his mouth, pulling his features into a permanent half-grimace. His dark hair fell in waves to his collar, streaked with premature silver at the temples. "You're on my land," she managed, her voice a weak rasp. Something that might have been amusement flickered in those remarkable eyes. "No, ma'am. You're on mine." Eliza frowned, fumbling for the map with clumsy fingers. "That's not possible. I was heading northeast from Willow Creek toward—" "You've been walking southeast for the past hour." He nodded toward the setting sun, now visible beneath the cloud bank, "heading straight for Thornton Land." "Thornton?" Her muddled thoughts struggled to place the name. "Caleb Thornton." He touched the brim of a battered hat she hadn't noticed he was wearing. "Your unwilling neighbor." Recognition dawned through her confusion. "The rider, on the ridge last night." A nod confirmed her suspicion. "Were you watching me?" she demanded, attempting to sound indignant despite her vulnerable position. "Watching the land." His gaze traveled over her flushed face and disheveled appearance. "Good thing, too. Another hour out here, and I'd have been digging a grave instead of delivering a lecture." The blunt assessment shocked her into silence. In Boston, no gentleman would have spoken so plainly to a lady about death, or anything else for that matter. But Boston rules clearly didn't apply in this wilderness, and this man, with his scarred face and direct gaze, was no gentleman by society's standards. Attempting to rise, Eliza found her legs uncooperative. Thornton caught her elbow, steadying her with a strength that seemed effortless. "Whoa there," he cautioned. "Heat sickness takes time to pass." "I need to return to my cabin." She tried to pull away, discomfited by his proximity and her own weakness. Not happening before dark, and not in your condition. His tone brooked no argument. My place is closer. You can rest there, head back in the morning. That would be most improper, Eliza protested automatically. Thornton's scarred mouth twisted into something between a grimace and a smile. Lady, out here improper is whatever gets you killed. Proper is whatever keeps you breathing. He gestured toward the thunderclouds massing overhead. Storm's coming. Flash floods in these ravines will drown you before you consider the proprieties. As if summoned by his words, thunder cracked directly overhead, followed by the first fat raindrops splattering against the dusty ground. Within moments, the gentle patter became a deluge, cold water shocking against Eliza's overheated skin. My maps! She gasped, trying to shield the papers already dissolving in her pocket. Thornton muttered something that might have been a curse, then swept her up into his arms with startling ease. Hold on to my neck, he ordered over the intensifying downpour. Too stunned to protest, Eliza found herself clutching his shoulders as he carried her down the rocky slope toward a horse sheltering beneath an overhang. She became acutely aware of his strength, the solidity of his chest against her side, and most disturbingly, the way one scarred hand cradled her torso just beneath her breast. I can walk, she managed, mortified by the intimacy of their position. And I can fly, he retorted, but I don't recommend either right now. At the horse, a magnificent black gelding that watched their approach with intelligent eyes, Thornton paused, considering the logistics of mounting while holding her. With efficiency that brooked no argument, he boosted her into the saddle, then swung up behind her, one arm securing her against his chest as he gathered the reins with his free hand. Hang on, he murmured, his breath warm against her ear as the horse moved out from their temporary shelter into the full fury of the storm. The journey passed in a blur of pelting rain and jarring motion. Eliza, still lightheaded from her encounter with the desert heat, found herself fighting to remain upright, despite Thornton's supporting arm. Every instinct from her Boston upbringing screamed at the impropriety of their position. Pressed against a stranger, his body curled protectively around hers as they rode through the storm. Yet beneath the propriety, a traitorous part of her registered the novel sensation of being held so securely, of surrendering control to someone capable of navigating this hostile landscape. Just as she feared her strength would fail entirely, a structure loomed through the curtain of rain. A low-slung ranch house built of the same adobe and timber as her uncle's cabin, but larger and clearly better maintained. A covered porch wrapped around two sides, and smoke curled from a stone chimney despite the unseasonable warmth. Thornton dismounted in a fluid motion, then reached up to lift her from the saddle. Her legs buckled as her feet touched ground, and once again she found herself gathered against his chest, carried like a child up the porch steps and through the front door, into warmth and unexpected comfort. The interior of Thornton's home defied her expectations. While rustic, the main room held evidence of refinement, shelves lined with leather-bound books, a desk positioned to catch natural light from the window, comfortable furniture that, while worn, spoke of quality craftsmanship. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, beside which a large dog, some mix of shepherd and hound, raised its head to regard the newcomers with cautious interest. Down, Scout, Thornton commanded, and the dog subsided, still watching Eliza with unblinking attention. He deposited her in a chair near the fire, then disappeared through a doorway, returning moments later with a blanket and a towel. Dry yourself, he instructed, dropping the towel in her lap. I'll make coffee. Eliza clutched the towel, suddenly aware of her state. Her clothes were plastered to her body. Her hair had escaped its pins entirely to hang in dripping tendrils around her face, and her hand still trembled slightly from her ordeal. She must look a perfect fright, though why she should care about her appearance before this gruff stranger puzzled her. Thank you for your assistance, Mr. Thornton, she said formally, attempting to restore some dignity to the situation. Thornton, busy at a cast-iron stove similar to her own, merely grunted in response. Eliza noticed he favored his right arm, the left held slightly away from his body as though the movement caused him pain. The scar on his face, she now saw, continued down his neck to disappear beneath his collar. You've been watching my property, she ventured, rubbing the towel over her sodden hair. May I ask why? He turned, regarding her with those remarkable amber eyes. Watching the land, he corrected. Been doing it since before it was yours. You knew my uncle? Everyone knew Ezekiel. Thornton poured coffee into 2 mugs, carrying them to the table. Man kept to himself, but he understood things others didn't. Things like the spring. Thornton's gaze sharpened. Who told you about that? No one, directly. Eliza wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, grateful for its warmth. But it seems to be the reason Mr. Montgomery is so interested in acquiring my property. Montgomery. Thornton spat the name like something distasteful. Man would buy the air we breathe if he could fence it. Then there is a spring? One worth more than gold? As I was told today. Thornton considered her for a long moment, as if weighing how much to reveal. There's water, he finally acknowledged. Deep water that doesn't fail even in drought. The Apache call it Nel Tizito, living water. And it's on my land, Eliza pressed, remembering the symbol on her maps and locket. Not exactly. Thornton leaned against the mantel, keeping his distance as if reluctant to approach too closely. The spring rises on the boundary between Willow Creek and my property, feeds both. Your uncle and I had an understanding. What kind of understanding? The kind that kept Montgomery's hands off the water. His expression hardened. The kind that protected something that shouldn't belong to any one person. Eliza frowned, trying to make sense of his cryptic answers through her lingering headache. If this spring is so valuable, why didn't Montgomery simply buy your ranch instead? A harsh laugh escaped Thornton. He tried, offered even more than he's offering you. His scarred mouth twisted. Some things aren't for sale. Like water in a drought? Like integrity? Thornton's gaze held hers. Your uncle understood that. Question is, do you? The challenge in his tone raised Eliza's hackles. Mr. Thornton, you know nothing about me or my understanding of anything. I know you're Eastern born and bred. I know you arrived less than 2 days ago with no knowledge of ranching or this country. His eyes traveled over her bedraggled appearance. And I know you nearly died today chasing water. You don't understand. I was exploring my property, Eliza retorted, stung by the accuracy of his assessment. You were trespassing on mine, he corrected mildly. After nearly killing yourself through ignorance. How dare you? Truth hurts, Miss Hargrove. Out here, ignorance kills faster than rattlesnakes. He pushed away from the mantel, moving to the window where rain still lashed against the glass. Your uncle asked me to watch over Willow Creek if anything happened to him. I intend to keep that promise whether you like it or not. I don't need a caretaker, Mr. Thornton. Evidence suggests otherwise. He turned back to her, his expression unreadable in the firelight. Drink your coffee. You need to rebuild your strength. Eliza wanted to refuse on principle, but the rich aroma tempted her parched throat. The coffee, when she sipped it, was nothing like her morning's disaster, smooth and flavorful without the bitterness she'd produced. It's good, she admitted reluctantly. Secret's in the roasting. Thornton's voice softened slightly. Your uncle taught me that. Men could make coffee that would resurrect the dead. You were friends, then? Neighbors. He shrugged his good shoulder. Out here, that can mean more than blood. The simple statement hung between them, reminding Eliza how little she knew of this country and its unwritten rules. In Boston, one's neighbors were acknowledged with formal calls and careful distance. Here, it seemed, neighborly bonds ran deeper. Deep enough for her uncle to entrust this scarred, solitary man with watching over his legacy. Mr. Thornton, she began, setting aside her pride, I would appreciate learning about this spring that seems to concern everyone so greatly. If it's as valuable as everyone implies, I should understand what I'm defending. Something like respect flickered in his eyes. Fair enough, but not tonight. He nodded toward the window where lightning illuminated the torrential downpour. Storms made the trails impassable. Questions about the spring will keep till morning. And where am I to sleep? Eliza asked, sudden awareness of her situation bringing heat to her cheeks. You'll take my bed. He forestalled her protest with a raised hand. I'll bunk out here by the fire. Scout will keep you safe. He whistled softly and the dog rose, padding to Eliza's side and regarding her with solemn eyes. This is highly irregular, she murmured, though the thought of a proper bed after her ordeal held undeniable appeal. "Welcome to Arizona, Miss Hargrove." Thornton's scarred mouth curved in what might have been a smile. Nothing regular about it. As if to emphasize his point, thunder cracked directly overhead, rattling the windows in their frames. Scout whined softly, pressing against Eliza's leg in a gesture that seemed oddly protective for a dog who'd known her less than an hour. "The storm," she began, but Thornton cut her off with a shake of his head. "We'll pass by morning. Get some rest. You look ready to fall over." His blunt assessment should have offended her, but Eliza was too exhausted to manufacture outrage. Rising on unsteady legs, she allowed him to guide her to a small bedroom at the rear of the house. Like the main room, it held unexpected refinements. A quilt of intricate design covered the narrow bed. A small desk stood beneath the window, and bookshelves lined one wall. "Washstands there," Thornton indicated the corner. "There's a nightshirt in the trunk that should serve. It was my—" He stopped abruptly. "It's clean." Before she could thank him, he was gone, leaving Eliza alone in the strangest situation she had yet encountered in this strange new land. She stood dripping on the braided rug, Scout settling himself across the threshold as if standing guard, and wondered what unfathomable twist of fate had delivered her from one predicament into an entirely different species of awkwardness. Yet as she changed into the offered nightshirt, clearly made for someone much larger, the sleeves falling past her fingertips, and slipped between clean sheets that smelled faintly of sage and sun-dried cotton, Eliza found herself oddly at peace. The rhythm of rain on the roof and the distant rumble of thunder created a lullaby unlike any she'd known in Boston. Her last conscious thought before sleep claimed her was that Caleb Thornton, for all his gruffness, had gentle hands for a man so scarred by life. Gentle hands, fierce eyes, and a connection to her uncle's legacy that might prove either her salvation or her undoing in this untamed land. Morning arrived with the gentle persistence of sunlight filtering through unfamiliar curtains. Eliza woke gradually, disoriented by the silence. No city sounds, no servants moving about, just the distant call of an unfamiliar bird and the soft woof of canine breathing. She opened her eyes to find Scout watching her from his position at the foot of the bed, his shaggy head tilted in silent assessment. "Good morning to you too," she murmured, earning a thump of tail against the quilt. The events of the previous day rushed back in a flood of mortifying clarity. She, Eliza Hargrove, had nearly perished from her own ignorance, been rescued like some helpless damsel, and was now lying in a stranger's bed, wearing what must be his nightshirt. In Boston, such a situation would have meant social ruination. Here in the wilds of Arizona territory, she had the disquieting sense that different rules applied, though what those rules might be remained a mystery. The aroma of coffee and something savory drifted beneath the door, rousing hunger she hadn't realized she possessed. Her clothes, she discovered, had been placed over a chair near the window, remarkably dry considering their sodden state the night before. Her hair, freed from its pins, tumbled in unruly waves past her shoulders. Without a proper mirror, the best she could manage was smoothing it back with her fingers and securing it in a simple knot at her nape. "This will have to do," she told Scout, who had watched her ablutions with patient interest. "I don't suppose you have any suggestions for appearing less disheveled?" The dog merely thumped his tail again, then rose and padded to the door, looking back at her expectantly. "Yes, I'm coming, though I confess I'm not looking forward to facing your master after yesterday's display of incompetence." Steeling herself, Eliza opened the bedroom door and followed Scout into the main room, where Caleb Thornton stood at the stove, his back to her. In daylight, she could better appreciate his lean, powerful build, the breadth of his shoulders tapering to narrow hips. His dark hair, caught back with a strip of leather, revealed the clean line of his jaw beneath the stubble of an unshaved morning. "Coffee's hot," he said without turning. "Breakfast in 5 minutes. You have remarkable hearing, Mr. Thornton." Scout's nails on the floorboards. Always knows when someone's up and moving. He glanced over his shoulder, those striking amber eyes assessing her in one swift sweep. "Sleep well?" "Better than I had any right to under the circumstances." Eliza moved to the table where coffee waited in a chipped mug. "Thank you for your hospitality." Thornton shrugged his good shoulder, returning his attention to whatever was sizzling in the cast-iron skillet. Like I said, can't have neighbors dying on my watch. Bad for property values." The dry humor surprised a genuine laugh from her. "Are property values a significant concern in this wilderness, Mr. Thornton?" "Depends on what you value." He transferred a generous portion of eggs scrambled with some kind of meat and peppers onto a plate, adding a thick slice of toast before placing it before her. "Eat. You need to rebuild your strength." His clinical tone should have reassured her, yet Eliza found herself oddly aware of his proximity as he poured his own coffee and settled across from her with a plate of his own. In the clear morning light, the scar on his face was more pronounced, a jagged line from temple to jaw that pulled slightly at the corner of his mouth. Rather than detracting from his appearance, it lent a compelling asymmetry to features that might otherwise have been too perfectly proportioned. "You're staring, Miss Hargrove." His voice held no offense, merely observation. Heat flooded her cheeks. "I apologize. That was unconscionably rude." "Curious, not rude." He touched the scar briefly. "Gift from a rebel bayonet at Gettysburg. I traded him a bullet for it, so I came out ahead in the bargain." "You fought for the Union?" "2nd Texas Cavalry." A shadow crossed his face. "Came west after. Didn't much care for crowds after the war." That explained the isolation of his ranch, though not the surprising refinement of his home's interior. As they ate in companionable silence, Eliza found her gaze drawn repeatedly to the bookshelves lining one wall, volumes of law, history, literature, and surprisingly, poetry, their leather spines worn with use. "You're an educated man, Mr. Thornton." His mouth twisted in what might have been a smile or a grimace. "Was. Once. Harvard Law, class of '58. At her startled expression, he added, "Expected I'd join my father's practice in Austin. War had other plans." "And after the war, why not return to the law? Some things break and don't mend right." His gaze drifted to his left arm, which he'd favored noticeably while cooking. "Found I preferred straightforward problems. Cattle, water, land. They don't lie or make excuses. Unlike people," Eliza ventured, "unlike lawyers." That half-smile again softening the harshness of his features. "Your uncle understood, said ranching was the perfect occupation for a man who preferred honest difficulties to dishonest ease." "You knew him well, then?" "Well enough." Thornton rose, taking their empty plates to a wash basin. She noticed how he compensated for his injured arm, using his body to brace what his left hand couldn't firmly grasp. "He mentioned a niece back east once or twice. Didn't expect you'd actually come when he left you the place." "Neither did I," Eliza admitted, carrying her coffee to the window. The storm had passed, leaving the desert washed clean, colors intensified against the backdrop of an impossibly blue sky. Yet here I am, woefully unprepared but determined nonetheless. Determination counts for something. Thornton joined her at the window, maintaining a careful distance. "Might even keep you alive if you learn to respect the land." "Is that what I failed to do yesterday? Respect the land?" "You failed to respect its dangers." His voice held no accusation, simply stating fact. "Desert looks empty to Eastern eyes." "It's not. It's full of life and death, often wearing the same face." He nodded toward a patch of delicate purple flowers blooming near the porch. "Those are lovely, aren't they? Also poisonous enough to kill a horse if eaten." "Like beauty concealing a deadly truth," Eliza murmured. Something flickered in his amber eyes. Surprise, perhaps, at her quick understanding? Exactly so. Their gazes held for a heartbeat too long, and Eliza found herself acutely aware of his height, the breadth of his shoulders, the faint scent of sage and leather that seemed to cling to him. She stepped back, disconcerted by her reaction to this scarred, solitary man. "Mr. Thornton, about yesterday, I was searching for the spring mentioned in my uncle's papers, the one marked with this symbol." She touched the locket at her throat. His expression closed immediately. "You shouldn't wander the desert alone, especially looking for that place." "Then perhaps you could show me where it is, since we appear to share access to it?" Thornton turned away, moving to the fireplace where he absently adjusted a log with the poker. "It's not that simple." Because of the Apache tribe you mentioned, Eliza pressed, sensing she was approaching something significant. He sighed, raking his good hand through his hair. The spring, Anantaziji toe rises in a box canyon that straddles our properties. The Apache consider it sacred water, water with healing properties. Your uncle respected that. As do you? I respect agreements. Thornton fixed her with that direct gaze. Ezekiel made a pact with Chief Natsili 20 years ago. The spring would remain undeveloped, accessible to the tribe for their ceremonies, in exchange for peace and occasional guidance. And Montgomery wishes to develop it? Montgomery wishes to control it. Bitterness edged his voice. Damn it, pipe it, sell it to the highest bidder. This drought has made water more valuable than silver from the Comstock lode. Eliza considered this revelation, understanding dawning. That's why he's so determined to buy my ranch, and yours. Now you're getting it. Thornton gave a curt nod. Together, our properties control the entire watershed that feeds the spring. Separate, neither of us can develop it without the other's cooperation. A natural partnership, Eliza mused, an idea forming, if you believe in such things. She set down her coffee cup and faced him directly. Mr. Thornton, I find myself in an unenviable position. I own a ranch I don't know how to run, in country I don't understand, with Montgomery and his men apparently determined to intimidate me into selling. That sums it up, he agreed dryly. I propose a solution that might benefit us both. Eliza drew a deep breath. You teach me ranching, how to manage the land, the livestock, how to survive in this wilderness. In exchange, I'll honor my uncle's agreement regarding the spring, ensuring Montgomery never gains control of it. Thornton's eyebrows rose. You're suggesting I become your tutor in frontier life? I'm suggesting a partnership. I have the legal title to half the spring's watershed. You have the knowledge I need to survive here. Together we can preserve what my uncle valued while preventing Montgomery from acquiring either of our properties. And if I refuse, then I expect Montgomery will eventually intimidate me into selling, after which he'll redouble his efforts to acquire your land as well. Eliza met his gaze steadily. I don't wish to be forced out, Mr. Thornton, but I'm realistic about my current limitations. The blunt honesty of her assessment seemed to catch him off guard. He studied her for a long moment, as if seeing her clearly for the first time, not merely as Ezekiel's Eastern niece, but as a woman with both determination and pragmatism. Your uncle would have appreciated your directness, he finally said, but you're asking for a significant commitment of my time and effort. I'm aware of that. I don't expect charity. Eliza straightened her shoulders. Once I learn enough to make Willow Creek productive, we can arrange fair compensation. It's not about money, Miss Hargrove. Then what is it about? His gaze drifted to the window, where something had caught his attention. Montgomery's men, he said quietly. 2 riders on the ridge. Eliza joined him at the window, careful not to stand directly in view. True enough, 2 mounted figures observed the ranch from a distance, their postures suggesting surveillance rather than casual passing. They're watching to see if I survived yesterday's mishap, she realized, perhaps wondering if the desert solved Montgomery's problem for him. More likely making sure you haven't already made a deal with me. Thornton's jaw tightened. Montgomery's been trying to drive a wedge between our properties for years. They stood in silence, watching the distant riders, who eventually turned and disappeared over the ridge. When they were gone, Thornton turned to face her, decision evident in his expression. 3 conditions, he said abruptly. First, you follow my instructions without argument when it comes to safety, no more wandering off alone until you know the land. Second, you commit to honoring your uncle's agreement with the Apache regardless of how profitable development might seem. Third, he hesitated. Yes, you never mention my background or education to anyone. Out here, I'm just a rancher. That's all I want to be. The request puzzled her, but Eliza nodded. Agreed. And my conditions are simple. Honest instruction and respect. I may be ignorant of frontier ways, but I'm neither stupid nor weak. That remains to be seen, he said. but the harshness of his words was belied by a glint of what might have been admiration in his eyes. We'll start with the basics. Water management, predator awareness, basic repairs, the rest can wait until you're less likely to die within your first week. Your confidence is overwhelming, Mr. Thornton. Call me Caleb, he said unexpectedly. If we're to be partners of a sort, formality seems excessive. Eliza, then, she offered in return. He nodded once, then extended his right hand. To our arrangement, Eliza Hargrove. Her smaller hand disappeared into his calloused grip, the contact sending an unexpected warmth up her arm. His palm was rough with work, yet his hold was careful, as if conscious of his strength. For a moment, neither moved, joined by this simple touch that somehow felt more intimate than propriety should allow. To our arrangement, Eliza echoed, reluctantly withdrawing her hand. When do we begin? We already have. Caleb's scarred mouth curved in a genuine smile that transformed his severe features, revealing the man he might have been before war and wilderness carved their marks upon him. Lesson 1. In the desert, water is life. Remember that, and you might survive long enough for lesson 2. As he turned away to gather his hat and gun belt, Eliza found herself watching the economical grace of his movements, the way sunlight caught the silver threading through his dark hair. Despite his scars and brusque manner, there was something compelling about Caleb Thornton, a quality of contained strength and unexpected depth that drew her curiosity like a moth to flame. Such thoughts were dangerous, she knew. She had come west for independence, not to trade one form of dependency for another. Yet as they prepared to ride back to Willow Creek, Eliza couldn't deny the flutter of something dangerously like attraction whenever those amber eyes met hers. A complication she hadn't anticipated, in a land already complex beyond her experience. Ready? Caleb asked from the doorway. Scout already bounding ahead to where horses waited in the corral. As I'll ever be, Eliza replied, straightening her shoulders and following him into the brilliance of the Arizona morning, where new lessons awaited. In ranching, in survival, and perhaps, in matters of the heart, she wasn't yet prepared to name. Option 3. Learning the land. I said hold her steady, not strangle the poor beast. Eliza loosened her death grip on the reins, earning a relieved snort from the dun mare beneath her. After a week of daily riding lessons, she'd progressed from abject terror to mere intense apprehension whenever the horse moved faster than a sedate walk. This morning, Caleb had insisted she attempt a trot, with results that left her backside bruised and her dignity in tatters. I'm trying, she gritted through clenched teeth as the mare danced sideways, sensing her rider's tension. Caleb circled them on his black gelding, his expression a mixture of exasperation and poorly concealed amusement. Trying to bounce clear off from the looks of it, you're fighting the rhythm. Move with her, not against her. Easy for you to say, Eliza muttered, attempting to mimic the easy way he sat his mount, as if man and horse were a single entity. You were probably born in a saddle, and you were born in a parlor, he countered without heat. But out here, a horse is your lifeline. Fall off in the wrong place, you're buzzard food by sundown. His blunt assessment might have shocked her a week ago. Now she merely sighed, gathering the reins more gently and nudging the mare forward. Again, then. Caleb's rare smile flickered briefly, transforming his stern features. That's the spirit. Heels down, back straight, eyes forward. Yes, Professor Thornton, I recall the lecture, Eliza interrupted, surprising a bark of laughter from him as she urged the mare into another bone-jarring trot. By the time they returned to Willow Creek, Eliza was sore in places she hadn't known could be sore, but a quiet satisfaction warmed her chest. She'd stayed mounted, managed several circuits of the training area without disgracing herself, and even earned a grudging, not entirely hopeless, from her exacting tutor. Progress, of a sort. The week had fallen into an unexpected rhythm. Each morning, Caleb arrived at first light, Scout loping alongside his horse. Breakfast was a swift, practical affair. Whatever Mrs. Sanchez had prepared the previous evening reheated while Caleb outlined the day's lessons. Then came hours of instruction in what Caleb deemed essential skills, from identifying poisonous plants to predicting weather from cloud formations. Practical lessons followed, each more physically demanding than the last. Fence mending had left her hands blistered until Caleb silently presented her with a pair of work gloves, worn but serviceable. Learning to properly operate the well pump had nearly pulled her shoulder from its socket until he showed her how to use her body weight rather than arm strength. Each night she collapsed into exhausted slumber, only to wake at dawn, ready to begin again, driven by a determination that surprised even herself. "You'll need to rebind that section by next week," Caleb said now, nodding toward the fence line they'd repaired 3 days prior. "Mesquite posts rot faster than cedar." "Your uncle knew that, but supplies were scarce during the war." Eliza dismounted with only a slight wince, leading her mare to the water trough. "I'll add it to my list, right after learn to trot without internal injury and convince chickens I'm not a predator." The last item referenced her disastrous attempt to gather eggs, which had resulted in a panicked flurry of feathers and several eggs smashed beyond salvation. Caleb had found her covered in yolk and chicken droppings, swearing in a most unladylike manner at the uncooperative hens. "He taught you to approach from the side, speaking low," he reminded her, the corners of his eyes crinkling with suppressed mirth at the memory. "I did," Eliza protested. "The wretched creature still attacked as if I were a fox in their henhouse." "Animals sense fear." Caleb unsaddled his gelding with practiced efficiency, compensating for his stiff left arm with movements so subtle Eliza might not have noticed had she not been watching closely. "Same as people." "Is that why you're so good with them? Because you fear nothing?" The question slipped out before she could reconsider its wisdom. Caleb stilled, one hand resting on the gelding's withers. For a moment, she thought he might not answer, but when he turned, his amber eyes held a shadow she hadn't seen before. "I fear plenty," he said quietly. "Just not the same things as most folks." Before she could inquire further, he hefted the saddle with his good arm and strode toward the barn, leaving Eliza with the distinct impression she'd glimpsed something he rarely revealed, a vulnerability beneath the capable exterior. She'd grown accustomed to watching him, noting how he adapted tasks to accommodate his injury without drawing attention to it. When lifting required 2 hands, he braced objects against his body. When strength was needed, he positioned himself to use his legs and torso rather than his damaged left arm. Never once did he complain or ask for assistance. The solutions he devised were ingenious. Speaking of a mind that saw obstacles as puzzles to be solved rather than impediments to be bemoaned. It was, Eliza had to admit, an admirable quality, and one she found herself trying to emulate as she faced her own struggles with frontier living. Mrs. Sanchez emerged from the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron. "Lunch is ready, Miss Eliza. I've made extra for Mr. Thornton, too." The plump, gray-hailed woman had proven a godsend, arriving each day to manage household tasks and prepare meals while Eliza focused on her lessons. At first, Eliza had felt awkward having someone else maintain her small home, but Mrs. Sanchez had gently insisted. "Your uncle would want you to learn the important things first," she'd said in her softly accented English. "Cooking and cleaning, those can come later." Now, Eliza watched as Mrs. Sanchez placed a basket of warm tortillas on the porch table beside bowls of beans, roasted chilies, and strips of spiced beef. The simple meal, seasoned with unfamiliar but delicious spices, had become a highlight of Eliza's days. "Senor Thornton," Mrs. Sanchez called toward the barn, "come eat before the flies do." Caleb emerged, his dark hair damp where he'd clearly splashed water on his face. "Smells good enough to keep the flies waiting," he called back, that rare smile making another brief appearance. As they ate, Eliza found herself studying him when he wasn't looking. The strong line of his jaw, the careful precision of his movements, the way the scar pulled slightly when he smiled. In Boston, his rugged appearance would have marked him as dangerous, unsuitable company for a lady. Here, she was beginning to understand that such judgments were as useless as silk parasols in a dust storm. "We need supplies," Caleb said, interrupting her wayward thoughts. "Nails, wire, salt. Thought we'd ride into town tomorrow." Eliza paused, bread halfway to her lips. "Together?" "Unless you've mastered telepathic shopping, yes." When she hesitated, he added, "Montgomery's men have been watching the property. Better not to ride alone." "I wasn't objecting," she clarified. "Just surprised you've avoided town since I arrived." "I avoid town as a general principle," he shrugged. "Too many opinions, too little space." Mrs. Sanchez snorted softly. Too many wagging tongues, more like. She cast a meaningful glance at Eliza. People talk, Miss Eliza. They see a single woman spending days with a single man. They think the worst. Eliza finished for her, understanding dawning. Even out here, propriety matters. Appearances matter, Caleb corrected. Truth rarely enters into gossip. Then we shall give them something legitimate to gossip about, Eliza declared, raising her chin. 2 neighbors conducting business in town seems perfectly proper to me. Mrs. Sanchez shook her head. You are very much like your uncle, Miss Eliza. He cared little for what others thought, too. A family trait, it seems. Eliza smiled at the older woman. Will you come with us tomorrow? I could use your guidance on household necessities. Ah, no, I cannot. Mrs. Sanchez glanced toward the horizon, where clouds were building. My grandson thinks the baby comes soon. I must be with my daughter. Of course, Eliza said quickly. Please don't worry about returning until the child is safely arrived. Family must come first. Mrs. Sanchez patted her hand. This is why your uncle chose you, I think. You have a good heart beneath your Eastern manners. After lunch, Caleb's lessons turned to the careful management of irrigation ditches, critical knowledge with the summer heat intensifying daily. Eliza found herself on her knees in the dirt, helping clear debris from channels that, according to Caleb, would direct precious water to garden plots once rains came in earnest. These haven't been properly maintained since your uncle fell ill, he said, expertly redirecting a small stream with strategic placement of rocks. But the system he designed is sound. With proper care, you could grow enough to sustain yourself and have surplus to trade. Eliza sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her brow with her sleeve, a gesture that would have scandalized her Boston acquaintances but now felt as natural as breathing. Did my uncle design all this himself? With help from Blackfeather, a medicine woman from Nitzili's band. She knew which plants would thrive here, how to arrange them to maximize water use. Caleb straightened, resting his good hand on his knee as he surveyed their work. Apache have been surviving here for generations. Your uncle was smart enough to learn from them instead of trying to impose Eastern methods. A lesson for his niece as well, I presume. His amber eyes crinkled slightly. You catch on quicker than most. The compliment, sparse as it was, warmed her more than it should have. Over the past week, she'd found herself working increasingly hard for those small signs of approval. Not from any sense of feminine validation, but because earning Caleb Thornton's respect felt like an achievement worth the effort. By late afternoon, Eliza's back ached from bending over irrigation ditches. Her hands were filthy despite the gloves, and her face felt scorched by the relentless sun. Yet satisfaction thrummed through her as she surveyed their accomplishments. Functional water channels, a garden plot ready for the first seeds Mrs. Sanchez had promised to provide, and a growing confidence in her ability to understand this harsh land. That's enough for today, Caleb announced, watching the western sky with a practiced eye. Storm's building, might hit by nightfall. So soon after the last one? Eliza glanced at the gathering clouds, remembering her misadventure. Summer pattern. Brief but intense. He gathered their tools, loading them efficiently into a canvas bag. Be inside before it hits. These can turn dangerous quick. Yes, Professor Thornton, she replied with mock solemnity, earning another of those rare smiles that transformed his face. You're learning, he said simply, and somehow that felt like the highest praise. Mesquite Springs looked different in the harsh light of morning than it had upon Eliza's arrival. The single dusty street seemed wider, the buildings more substantial now that she viewed them without the haze of exhaustion clouding her perceptions. Still, the town remained a primitive outpost compared to Boston's ordered streets and elegant structures. Riding beside Caleb drew attention immediately. Curtains twitched as they passed, and the few people on the boardwalks paused in their activities to stare openly. Eliza kept her spine straight, chin lifted in unconscious mimicry of her posture during Boston social occasions when whispers had followed her after her father's disgrace. Quite the reception committee, she murmured to Caleb, who rode with the loose-limbed ease she envied. Told you, too many opinions. His expression remained impassive, but she noticed how his good hand rested casually near the revolver at his hip, a subtle signal she might have missed a week ago. They hitched their horses outside the general store, a weathered building with Peterson's Mercantile painted across its false front. Inside, the store smelled of leather, coffee, and the peculiar blend of spices and dry goods that seemed universal to trading posts across the country. A bell jangled as they entered, and conversation halted as abruptly as if someone had drawn a knife. 3 women standing near the fabric counter stared openly, then bent their heads together in whispered consultation. A grizzled miner examining picks nudged his companion, nodding in their direction. At the rear of the store, a tall, thin man Eliza recognized as the store's proprietor emerged from a back room, his expression shifting from welcome to wariness as he spotted Caleb. "Miss Hargrove," he greeted, pointedly ignoring her companion. "A pleasure to see you in town. What can Peterson's provide for you today?" "Good morning, Mr. Peterson. I have quite a list, actually." Eliza produced the carefully prepared inventory of supplies, keeping her tone brisk and businesslike. "Mr. Thornton has kindly escorted me to town and will assist with transporting the heavier items." Peterson's gaze flickered to Caleb, who had moved to examine a display of tools with deliberate casualness. "I see." The shopkeeper's tone spoke volumes. "Well, let me just attend to your needs, then." As Peterson began gathering items from her list, a plump woman in a severe black dress approached, her face arranged in an expression of concerned propriety that Eliza instantly recognized from Boston drawing rooms. "Miss Hargrove, I'm Dorothea Peterson." The woman's voice carried clearly through the store. "My husband mentioned you'd arrive to claim poor Ezekiel's property. I do hope you're finding everything satisfactory." The emphasis on the last word, accompanied by a significant glance toward Caleb, made her meaning transparent. Eliza summoned the cool smile she'd perfected during her father's scandal. "Quite satisfactory, Mrs. Peterson. Willow Creek is proving a worthy inheritance." "Indeed, though it must be terribly isolated for a young woman of your background." Mrs. Peterson lowered her voice to a stage whisper. "If you ever feel unsafe or in need of proper company, you must come to us. We understand the challenges of frontier living." "How very kind." Eliza maintained her pleasant expression with effort. "Though I've found no lack of assistance, Mr. Thornton has been most generous with his knowledge of ranching." Mrs. Peterson's mouth pinched like a drawstring purse. "Yes, well, Mr. Thornton has his qualities, I'm sure, but a young woman in your position must consider appearances. There has already been talk." "Has there?" Eliza's voice cooled perceptibly. How fascinating that people with livestock to tend, crops to water, and businesses to run would find time to discuss my affair. From the corner of her eye, she saw Caleb's shoulders tense, though he remained focused on examining a coil of wire with excessive attention. Mrs. Peterson drew herself up. "I speak only out of concern, Miss Hargrove. That man," she lowered her voice again, "is damaged. The war broke something in him beyond that arm. They say he hasn't been right since he came back, keeping to himself, avoiding decent folk. Perhaps he simply prefers honest difficulties to dishonest ease," Eliza replied, deliberately echoing Caleb's description of her uncle's philosophy. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have supplies to purchase." She turned away, heart hammering at her own temerity. In Boston, such direct confrontation would have been unthinkable. Here it felt necessary, even liberating. The remainder of their shopping proceeded with only the most essential conversation, weighted by the watchful eyes of the store's other patrons. Eliza maintained her composure, selecting household necessities with careful attention to both quality and price, acutely aware of her limited funds. Caleb remained nearby, occasionally offering practical suggestions in a low voice when she hesitated over unfamiliar items. His presence, solid and unobtrusive, steadied her more than she cared to admit. "Add 2 of those," he murmured as she examined lantern oil. "Nights get longer come fall." "And the blue tin of coffee," he added later. "It's what your uncle preferred." These small insights into her unknown relative accumulated like treasures, helping Eliza construct a picture of the man whose legacy she'd inherited. By the time Peterson tallied their purchases, she felt oddly closer to Uncle Ezekiel despite never having met him. "That comes to $13.42. Peterson announced, eyeing the substantial pile of goods. Shall I add it to Mr. Montgomery's account? He mentioned he'd be covering your expenses. Eliza stiffened. Did he indeed? How presumptuous. I'll pay cash, thank you. She counted out the money carefully, aware of how quickly her small reserve of funds was dwindling. The practicalities of ranch life were proving more expensive than anticipated, and without income, her situation would soon become precarious. As if reading her thoughts, Caleb spoke quietly while Peterson wrapped parcels. Your uncle left 3 steers and a bull in my north pasture before he fell ill. They're yours whenever you're ready to claim them. The quiet offer of assistance, made without fanfare or expectation, touched Eliza unexpectedly. Thank you, she whispered. For everything. His amber eyes met hers briefly. Partners, remember? The bell above the door jangled, drawing every eye in the store. James Montgomery stood in the entrance, his tall figure blocking the sunlight, creating a silhouette of imposing proportions. As he stepped inside, his pale blue gaze swept the store before settling on Eliza with unsettling intensity. Miss Hargrove! He removed his hat with practiced gallantry. What a pleasant surprise. I was just speaking of you to my foreman. Mr. Montgomery? Eliza inclined her head coolly. What a coincidence. Hardly coincidence in a town this size. His smile revealed perfect teeth white against his tanned face. Word travels faster than horses. His gaze shifted to Caleb, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Thornton. Still playing Good Samaritan, I see. Montgomery? Caleb's acknowledgement was curt, his posture subtly shifting to place himself between Eliza and the newcomer. Montgomery's smile never wavered, but something dangerous flickered in his pale eyes. Miss Hargrove, I hope you'll allow me to escort you to lunch at the hotel. We have business matters to discuss. Any business can be stated here, Eliza replied evenly. I'm quite occupied with purchases today. I've increased my offer for Willow Creek. $6,000, cash in hand. Montgomery stepped closer, lowering his voice, though not enough to prevent the avid listeners nearby from hearing. A most generous sum, as I'm sure you'll agree. The amount was indeed startling, a small fortune that would secure her future comfortably. For a moment, Eliza wavered, imagining the security such funds would provide. Then she remembered her uncle's hidden maps, the spring's significance to the Apache, and the agreement Caleb had described. Your generosity continues to astonish, Mr. Montgomery, she said carefully. But my position remains unchanged. I have no intention of selling Willow Creek. Montgomery's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Miss Hargrove, you cannot possibly imagine the challenges of maintaining such property. The drought alone is precisely why water rights are so valuable, she interrupted, as I'm sure you're aware. A murmur rippled through the store at her directness. Montgomery's smile tightened, becoming something altogether less charming. I see Thornton has been filling your head with notions. His gaze shifted to Caleb, who remained silent but watchful. Did he mention our history, how we once worked together before his unfortunate decline? That's enough, Montgomery. Caleb's voice held a quiet warning. I only mean to ensure Miss Hargrove has all relevant facts before making decisions that affect her future. Montgomery turned back to Eliza. Did you know your neighbor once practiced law for me? Quite brilliant, before Gettysburg scrambled more than his arm. The revelation startled Eliza, though she kept her expression neutral. Caleb had mentioned Harvard Law, but not any connection to Montgomery. Mr. Thornton's past employment is hardly relevant to my decision, she said firmly. My uncle chose me as his heir for a reason, and I intend to honor that trust. Ezekiel Hargrove was a stubborn old fool who valued sentiment over sense, Montgomery snapped, his composure finally cracking. That land needs proper management, not romantic notions about sacred springs and Apache superstitions. My uncle's arrangements regarding the spring will continue, Eliza stated, raising her chin, as will my ownership of Willow Creek Ranch. The store had gone utterly silent, every ear straining to catch the exchange. Montgomery's face flushed darkly beneath his tan, but he mastered himself with visible effort. I see Thornton's influence has already taken root. He settled his hat back on his head with deliberate precision. A pity. I had hoped reason would prevail. Reason dictates I maintain control of a valuable water source during drought, Eliza replied, surprising herself with her composure. Any businessman would make the same decision. Montgomery's cold smile returned. Indeed, though business in this territory often follows rules Eastern sensibilities might find challenging. He nodded curtly. Good day, Miss Hargrove. I suspect we'll speak again soon. The bell jangled as he departed, leaving a wake of whispers and significant glances. Eliza released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her hands trembling slightly as reaction set in. I'll take these to the wagon, Caleb said quietly, gathering their wrapped parcels with efficient movements. His face revealed nothing, but a muscle jumped in his jaw, betraying tension beneath his calm exterior. Outside, away from prying eyes, Eliza finally addressed what Montgomery had revealed. You worked for him? Caleb secured a parcel in the small wagon they'd brought for supplies, his movements precise. Briefly, after the war, before I bought my land. As a lawyer? As a mistake. He met her gaze directly. Not one I care to repeat. The simplicity of his answer, devoid of excuses or elaboration, struck Eliza as profoundly honest. Whatever had transpired between these men went deeper than a mere employment dispute, but Caleb clearly had no intention of sharing those details. Fair enough, she said after a moment. We all have chapters we'd prefer remained closed. Something like relief flickered in his amber eyes. Montgomery won't give up easily, he warned, changing the subject. That offer will increase until you're tempted. Perhaps. Eliza straightened her shoulders, drawing strength from her successful stand against both Montgomery and the town's judgment. But some things aren't for sale. Isn't that what you told me? The ghost of a smile touched Caleb's scarred mouth. You're learning faster than I expected, Eliza Hargrove. Coming from him, it felt like the highest praise, and somehow worth more than all Montgomery's thousands. As they loaded the last of their supplies, Eliza caught sight of Mrs. Peterson watching from the store window, her expression a mixture of disapproval and fascination. Let them talk, Eliza thought with newfound defiance. Let them whisper about the Eastern woman who stood her ground against Montgomery, who rode with the scarred recluse, who chose her uncle's legacy over easy wealth. She was beginning to understand that in this harsh land, respect wasn't granted by social position or family connections. It was earned through actions, through choices made when easiest paths beckoned. Today, she had taken a step toward earning that respect, not just from the watching town, but from the taciturn man whose opinion had somehow become important to her. As they turned the wagon toward Willow Creek, Eliza found herself smiling, despite the morning's tension. For the first time since arriving in Arizona territory, she felt something beyond determination driving her forward. Something that felt suspiciously like belonging. The spring? Revealed blindfolded. You can't be serious. Eliza eyed the strip of black cloth Caleb held out to her with undisguised suspicion. 3 weeks had passed since their confrontation with Montgomery in town, weeks filled with daily lessons that had transformed her from helpless tenderfoot to something approaching competence. She could now ride without fearing for her life, operate the well pump without straining her shoulder, and even gather eggs without sending the chickens into apoplectic fits. But this was unexpected. Dead serious, Caleb replied, the morning sunlight catching the amber flecks in his eyes. The location of the spring stays secret, even from those who own the land. That seems rather extreme, she protested. It's partially on my property, after all. Not according to the Apache. He held her gaze steadily. The spring belongs to the earth. We're just its guardians. Something in his tone told Eliza this wasn't negotiable. With a sigh of resignation, she turned her back to him. Very well, but if you lead me into a cactus patch, I'll never forgive you. Fair enough. His voice held a hint of amusement as he stepped closer. Eliza's breath caught as his hands came around her head, positioning the cloth over her eyes. His nearness sent an absurd flutter through her midsection, a reaction she'd been fighting with increasing frequency during their daily lessons. The brush of his fingers against her temples as he secured the knot was disturbingly intimate, his breath warm against her hair. Too tight? He asked, his voice low near her ear. No, she managed, grateful the blindfold hid whatever might be visible in her eyes. It's fine. Good. I'll help you mount. Out of the warning, his hands gripped her waist, lifting her easily into the saddle. Even through layers of clothing, his touch seemed to burn, and Eliza was grateful her sudden flush could be attributed to the morning heat. "I have the reins," Caleb informed her, his voice now coming from below. "Trust me to guide you." Trust. Such a simple word for such a complicated concept. Yet over these weeks of lessons and shared labor, trust had grown between them, grudgingly at first, then with increasing ease. Caleb had proven himself a demanding but fair teacher, never asking more than she could give, but refusing to accept less than her best effort. In return, she had shown herself willing to learn, to adapt, to embrace the challenges of this harsh land, rather than surrender to its difficulties. "I trust you," she said, and meant it. The journey seemed to take hours, though Eliza suspected it was far less. Without sight, her other senses heightened. The creak of leather beneath her, the rhythmic sway of the mare's gait, the changing sounds as they moved from open terrain into what must be more enclosed spaces. The air grew cooler, damper, carrying unfamiliar scents of moisture and green growing things that seemed out of place in the arid landscape she'd come to know. "We're walking now," Caleb warned as the horses slowed. "Keep your head low. Branches." Eliza ducked obediently, reaching up to protect her face as something leafy brushed her arm. The ground beneath the horses' hooves changed from loose stone to what sounded like sand, their steps muffled. Birds called nearby, not the harsh cries of desert hawks, but sweeter, bubbling songs she hadn't heard since leaving the east. "We're here." Caleb's hand touched her knee, steadying her as the mare halted. "I'm going to help you down. Ready?" She nodded, reaching out blindly. His hands found her waist again, lifting her from the saddle with that effortless strength that never failed to surprise her. This time, he set her down more slowly, his hands lingering a moment longer than necessary. "Can I remove this now?" she asked, reaching for the blindfold. "Not yet." His fingers encircled her wrist, gently drawing her hand away. "Take 3 steps forward first. I want you to feel it before you see it." Puzzled but intrigued, Eliza allowed him to position her shoulders, then took 3 careful steps in the direction he indicated. The air against her face changed, becoming noticeably cooler and laden with moisture. A sound reached her ears, the gentle music of water moving over stone, a sound so foreign to this parched land that it seemed almost miraculous. "Now," Caleb said softly, directly behind her. "Now you can look." His fingers brushed her hair as he untied the blindfold. Eliza blinked against the sudden light, then gasped as the scene before her came into focus. They stood at the edge of a small canyon whose walls rose perhaps 30 feet on either side, creating a protected hollow hidden from casual discovery. At its center lay a pool of water, so clear she could see every pebble on its bottom, fed by a spring that bubbled up from beneath a rock formation resembling an eagle's spread wings. The water spilled from the pool into a narrow stream that disappeared through a crevice in the canyon wall, but it was the green that truly stole her breath. Lush vegetation surrounded the spring in concentric circles, from delicate ferns and water-loving flowers at the pool's edge to desert-adapted trees and shrubs farther out. The contrast against the red gold stone of the canyon was startlingly beautiful, like finding an emerald set in copper. "It's," Eliza faltered, words inadequate to express the wonder before her. "Yes," Caleb agreed simply, understanding her speechlessness. "It is." She moved forward as if drawn by an invisible thread, kneeling beside the pool. The water's surface reflected the sky above, so still it seemed solid until a tiny ripple from the spring's source sent light dancing across it. Without thinking, she trailed her fingers through the cool water, marveling at its clarity. "Nertiji to," came a voice from behind them, speaking the words Caleb had used when first describing the spring. Eliza turned to find an older man watching them from the shadow of the canyon wall. Tall and straight despite his years, he wore buckskin leggings and a cotton shirt partially covered by a vest adorned with intricate beadwork. His face was deeply lined, weathered by sun and time, his dark eyes keen beneath a headband securing long silver-streaked hair. "2 hawks," Caleb greeted him with a respectful nod. "This is Eliza Hargrove, Ezekiel's niece." The man studied her with an intensity that might have been uncomfortable had it not been so clearly free of malice. "The one who wears the water sign," he said, in lightly accented English, gesturing toward the locket visible at her throat. Eliza's hand went to the silver pendant. Yes, it was my uncle's. Two hawks approached, moving with the silent grace of one accustomed to traveling undetected. He stopped a respectful distance away, his gaze still assessing. "Your uncle said one would come who carried the water sign," he said. "One with fire in their spirit, but wisdom in their heart." Caleb made a soft sound that might have been surprise. "You never mentioned that. It was not yet time." Two hawks shifted his attention back to Eliza. "May I see the sign?" Eliza hesitated only briefly before unfastening the locket's chain, placing the silver oval in his weathered palm. Two hawks examined it carefully, tracing the flowing pattern with one finger before turning it over to reveal an inscription Eliza hadn't noticed before. Symbols that resembled no alphabet she recognized. "What does it say?" she asked, curiosity overcoming reticence. "It speaks of covenant," Two Hawks replied. "A promise between your blood and my people. 3 generations past, when white settlers first came to this valley, there was much fighting over water rights." His dark eyes held Eliza's. "Your grandfather's brother, the one you call Ezekiel, he was different. He saw the spring not as something to own, but as something to protect." "My great-uncle made an agreement with your tribe," Eliza guessed. Two Hawks nodded. "A covenant. The spring would remain undammed, unpolluted, accessible to the people for our ceremonies. In return, we would share knowledge of how to live on this land without destroying it." He returned the locket to her. "The water sign marks those who kept this covenant." Eliza fastened the chain around her neck again, the locket's weight now laden with new significance. "And my uncle continued this agreement." "Ezekiel honored the old ways," Two Hawks confirmed. "When others would have broken the covenant for profit, he stood firm." His gaze shifted briefly to Caleb. Like this one, he understood that some oaths transcend paper laws. Caleb had moved to the pool's edge, his back to them as he examined something in the water. The set of his shoulders suggested discomfort with the elder's praise. "The man Montgomery does not understand such things," Two Hawks continued. "To him, water is like gold, something to possess, to control. He has threatened many times to find this place, to claim it for his cattle empire." "That's why the blindfold," Eliza realized, "and why the location is kept secret even from those who own the land. Even those who think they own it," Two Hawks corrected gently. "The earth belongs to itself. We are but guests upon it." The notion struck Eliza as both foreign and oddly compelling. In Boston, property was paramount, the foundation of society, the measure of success. Yet standing beside this hidden spring, surrounded by life it had nurtured for countless generations, the concept of ownership seemed suddenly presumptuous. "Tell me about my uncle," she requested, settling on a smooth boulder at the pool's edge. "I never knew him." For the next hour, Two Hawks shared stories of Ezekiel Hargrove, his arrival in the territory as a young man fleeing family conflict, his struggle to establish Willow Creek Ranch during drought years and Apache wars, his gradual transformation from Eastern tenderfoot to respected rancher. The portrait that emerged was of a complex man, stubborn in his principles, yet adaptable in his methods, solitary in his habits, yet deeply connected to the land and its original inhabitants. "He spoke of you," Two Hawks said, surprising her. "In his final season, when the sickness had weakened his body, he said his brother's grandchild had his spirit, too independent for Eastern cages." Eliza's throat tightened. "How could he know? We never met." "He kept watch through letters, through newspaper accounts." Two Hawks' weathered face softened slightly. "The scandal with your father. This pained him. He wished to write to you then, but feared his connection might bring more shame upon you." The mention of her father's disgrace still stung, but less sharply than before. "He knew about that?" "He knew many things." Two Hawks rose, signaling an end to the conversation. "Including that you would come when the time was right." He glanced skyward, where clouds were beginning to gather on the western horizon. Rain comes. I must return to my people. Before Eliza could thank him for his stories, the elder had melted into the shadows of the canyon as silently as he'd appeared, leaving her with far more questions than answers. Caleb returned to her side, having given her space for the conversation. "You all right?" "I'm not entirely sure," she admitted. "It's rather disconcerting to discover your life has been observed from afar by a relative you never knew existed." Ezekiel was a complicated man. Caleb offered his hand, helping her to her feet, but a good one. He wouldn't have interfered with your life without cause. Apparently he saw something in me worth watching. Eliza brushed sand from her skirt, trying to process all she'd learned, though how he determined I possessed fire in my spirit but wisdom in my heart from newspaper accounts is beyond me. "It's not beyond me," Caleb said quietly. The simple statement, delivered without flourish, caused Eliza to look up sharply. His amber eyes held an expression she couldn't quite decipher, something warmer than respect but more guarded than admiration. "We should head back," he said, breaking the moment. "Storm's building faster than I expected." Indeed, the sky had darkened dramatically during their time at the spring, clouds massing along the western ridge in towering formations that promised significant rainfall. As they mounted their horses and began the return journey, without blindfolds this time, Eliza noted with relief. The air around them grew heavy with anticipation, electric with the coming storm. "Will the rain reach the spring?" she asked as they emerged from the canyon's shelter. "Eventually. The watershed covers several miles in each direction." Caleb pointed toward a distant ridge. "Water falling there will find its way underground to feed the spring, even if it takes months to reach it." "Like everything else in this country," Eliza observed, "processes that would be immediate in the East take time here. Most worthwhile things do." He glanced at her with the hint of a smile that never failed to transform his stern features. "Patience is the first lesson of desert living." "And here I thought the first lesson was, don't wander off alone," she retorted, drawing a low chuckle from him that warmed her more than it should have. They rode in companionable silence for a time, Eliza absorbing the dramatic landscape as storm clouds cast patterns of shadow and light across the rugged terrain. Despite 3 weeks of daily exploration, the vastness of Willow Creek still awed her. The sudden drops into hidden canyons, the rocky outcroppings that resembled sculptures carved by giant hands, the unexpected pockets of life that defied the harsh conditions. When they reached a particularly striking overlook, Caleb reined his gelding to a halt. "Let's rest the horses a few minutes. Views worth seeing before the storm hits." Eliza had no objection. Her riding had improved significantly, but hours in the saddle still left her muscles protesting. They dismounted at the edge of a cliff that offered a sweeping panorama of the valley below, the distant buildings of Mesquite Springs visible as tiny specks against the landscape. "It's beautiful," she said softly, the vastness before her stirring emotions she couldn't quite name. In Boston, one's vision is always constrained by buildings, by trees, by the press of humanity. Here, one can see forever. "That bothers some people," Caleb observed, standing close enough that she could feel his presence without their bodies touching. "Makes them feel small, insignificant. And you?" He considered the question seriously, as he did most things. "No. It reminds me there are forces greater than human ambition. After the war." He trailed off, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "After seeing what men will do to one another over pride and principle, there's comfort in that reminder." It was the closest he'd come to discussing his experiences during the conflict, and Eliza sensed the significance of the confidence. "My father said much the same when he returned from serving as a quartermaster," she offered in exchange, "though he found solace in different ways." "The bottom of a bottle?" Caleb guessed without judgment. "Among other escapes." Eliza hadn't intended to speak of her family's shame, yet here on this windswept overlook the words came more easily than expected. When business reverses followed, he sought increasingly desperate remedies. Eventually he embezzled funds from his investors, respected families who had trusted him for decades. And when he was discovered, he took the coward's way out. Even now, the bitterness lingered, left my mother and me to face the consequences alone. She died within the year, more from humiliation than illness, I believe. Caleb was silent for a long moment. I'm sorry, he finally said, simple words carrying genuine empathy. It's in the past. Eliza lifted her chin, the familiar defensive gesture automatic after years of whispers and sidelong glances in Boston society. Though apparently my uncle knew of it all. Ezeal kept track of family, even those who'd disowned him. Caleb's expression softened slightly. He'd have admired your courage in coming west, instead of accepting charity from fair-weather connections. Was it courage or desperation, I wonder? The question had haunted Eliza since her impulsive decision to claim her inheritance. Does it matter? Results are the same. Caleb's practical philosophy struck her as refreshingly direct after years of Boston's social pretensions. You're here. You're learning. You're honoring his legacy. A sudden gust of wind swept across the overlook, carrying the distinct scent of approaching rain. In the valley below, a curtain of precipitation was already visible, advancing steadily toward them. We should go, Caleb said, eyeing the storm's progress. That's moving faster than I expected. They had just mounted when the first heavy drops began to fall, pattering against the dusty ground with audible impacts. Within moments, the scattered drops became a deluge, water sluicing down in sheets that instantly saturated clothing and obscured vision beyond a few yards. This way! Caleb shouted over the sudden roar of rainfall, wheeling his gelding toward a narrow gap in the rocks Eliza wouldn't have noticed. There's shelter. They urged their horses through the gap into a shallow canyon, following its twisting course until they reached a recessed alcove beneath an overhanging ledge. The space was just deep enough to shelter both horses and riders from the worst of the downpour, though wind occasionally drove sprays of moisture into their refuge. Dismounting, Eliza pushed sodden hair from her face, shivering despite the lingering warmth of the day. Her riding habit clung uncomfortably to her body, water dripping from the hem in steady rivulets. Here, Caleb shrugged out of his duster, draping it around her shoulders despite his own drenched condition. It's wet, but it'll block the wind. The coat enveloped her, still carrying his warmth and the now familiar scent of leather and sage that she'd come to associate with him. Thank you, but you'll freeze. Takes more than a little rain to trouble me. He turned to secure the horses, using the task as an excuse to put distance between them and the confined space. Eliza understood his caution. Over the past weeks, they had developed a careful choreography of proximity, close enough for instruction but never lingering, physical contact limited to the necessities of ranch work. Both seemed acutely aware of the potential for gossip, especially after their confrontation with Mrs. Peterson in town. Yet here, isolated by the storm's fury, that choreography felt suddenly artificial. Eliza found herself watching the play of muscles beneath Caleb's wet shirt as he rubbed down the nervous horses, the practiced efficiency of his movements despite his injured arm, the way water beaded in his dark hair before trailing down the strong column of his neck. It's magnificent, isn't it? She said, desperate to break the strange tension building within her. The storm, I mean. Caleb turned, catching her watching him. Something flickered in his amber eyes. Awareness, perhaps, of the charged atmosphere that had nothing to do with the lightning cracking overhead. Desert storms are like desert people, he said, moving to stand beside her at the alcove's edge. No patience for half measures, all fury, or all calm, nothing in between. They stood in silence for a time, watching the transformation of the landscape as water cascaded over rocks, filled dry washes, and turned dust to mud in minutes. The scent of rain-soaked earth filled the air, a primal perfume that stirred something deep and elemental. It's like watching the land come alive, Eliza murmured, as if it's been holding its breath, waiting for this moment. It has. Caleb's voice had dropped, pitched just loud enough to carry over the storm's diminishing roar. Everything here endures, waiting for renewal. Plants, animals, people. The last word hung between them, laden with meaning Eliza wasn't certain she should acknowledge. She turned to find him watching her, his expression unguarded in a way she'd never seen before. Caleb, she began, uncertain what she meant to say. I know, he shook his head slightly. This isn't wise. What isn't? She challenged, her pulse quickening. This? His gesture encompassed the space between them, the isolation, the growing tension neither seemed able to dismiss. "You're Ezekiel's niece, my neighbor, my responsibility." "I'm none of those things at this moment," Eliza said softly. "I'm just a woman standing with a man, watching the rain." Something shifted in his eyes, a barrier lowering. "Eliza." She never learned what he meant to say, for at that moment a tremendous crack of thunder directly overhead startled her. She jumped instinctively toward him, and his arms came around her with equal instinct, steadying her against his chest. Time suspended in that embrace. Eliza became acutely aware of his heartbeat beneath her cheek, the solid strength of him against the storm's fury, the gentle pressure of his hand at the small of her back. When she tilted her head to thank him, the words died unspoken as their eyes met. Neither could later recall who moved first. Perhaps they came together by mutual gravity, inevitable as water finding its level. His lips met hers with tentative pressure that swiftly deepened as she responded, her hands sliding up his chest to his shoulders. The kiss transformed from hesitant to hungry in the space of a heartbeat. Caleb's arms tightened around her, drawing her fully against him as her fingers threaded into his damp hair. All the tension of the past weeks, all the careful distance they'd maintained, dissolved in a rush of sensation that left Eliza dizzy with its intensity. He tasted of rain and something uniquely him, his lips firm yet surprisingly gentle as they moved over hers. One hand rose to cradle her face, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek with a tenderness that made her heart ache. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unevenly, the storm had begun to subside around them. Sunlight pierced the thinning clouds in golden shafts that turned raindrops to diamonds against the reddened stone. Caleb's voice was rougher than usual, his eyes darker as they searched her face. "Unexpected," Eliza supplied, though the word seemed woefully inadequate, but not unwelcome. His expression remained serious, though his hand still rested lightly at her waist. "This complicates matters." "Life is complications," she countered. "Why should this be different?" "Because you deserve better than a broken-down veteran with more scars than prospects." The harshness of his self-assessment contrasted sharply with the gentleness of his touch as he tucked a strand of damp hair behind her ear. "Perhaps I'm capable of determining what I deserve." Eliza placed her palm against his chest, feeling his heart's steady rhythm beneath her fingers. "And what I want." Uncertainty flickered across his face, an expression she'd never seen on this man who approached all other aspects of life with such quiet confidence. Before he could respond, the horses shuffled restlessly, reminding them of the passing time and the journey yet to complete. "We should return before the washes flood," Caleb said, reluctantly stepping back from their embrace. "This much rain will make some trails impassable." The practical consideration couldn't entirely dispel the lingering warmth of his touch, but Eliza nodded her agreement. Of course. They prepared to leave in silence, heavy with unspoken thoughts. As Caleb helped her mount, his hands lingered a fraction longer at her waist, his gaze meeting hers with an intensity that sent heat blooming in her chest despite her damp clothing. The ride back to Willow Creek passed in charged silence, both hyper-aware of the other's presence, yet uncertain how to bridge the sudden emotional distance that had replaced their physical closeness. The landscape around them had been transformed by the rainfall. Dry washes now carried rushing water, desert plants stood taller as if stretching toward the moisture, and the very air seemed cleansed of dust and filled with the scent of renewal. When they reached her cabin, the sun was setting behind them, painting the sky in spectacular hues of gold and crimson. Caleb dismounted first, then lifted Eliza from her saddle with careful hands that betrayed none of the passion they had shared in the canyon alcove. "Thank you for showing me the spring," she said, searching for solid footing in the shifting terrain of their relationship. "And for sharing Two Hawks' stories about my uncle." Caleb nodded, his expression guarded once more. "You had a right to know. It's your legacy now. As is this," she added, gesturing toward the ranch that was gradually taking shape under their combined efforts. Fences mended, garden planted, corral rebuilt to accommodate the small herd they would soon bring from Caleb's north pasture. "Yes." His gaze softened as it swept over her home. "Ezekiel would be pleased with what you've accomplished." "What we've accomplished," she corrected gently. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Something flickered in his amber eyes. Pride, perhaps? Or affection, carefully restrained? "You'd have found a way. You've got his stubborn streak." The compliment warmed her, but Eliza sensed his withdrawal, the careful distance he was reinstating between them. "Caleb, about what happened?" "The rain was unexpected," he interrupted, his tone deliberately casual, "but the land needed it. Should green up nicely over the next few days." The deliberate misunderstanding stung, but Eliza recognized the tactic for what it was, not rejection, but retreat. This man who had survived war and wilderness was somehow unnerved by the connection forming between them. "Yes," she said after a moment, accepting his lead for now. "The rain was most welcome." They stood awkwardly on her porch, the memory of their kiss hovering between them like the lingering scent of the storm. Finally, Caleb cleared his throat. "I'll come by tomorrow to check the washes, make sure no damage was done to the irrigation channels." He gathered his gelding's reins, preparing to depart. "I'll expect you at the usual time, then," Eliza replied, maintaining the fiction that nothing had changed between them. He nodded once, then surprised her by reaching out to touch her cheek, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "Good night, Eliza." Before she could respond, he'd mounted and ridden away, his figure silhouetted against the sunset as he'd been that first evening she'd seen him watching from the ridge. Eliza remained on the porch long after he'd disappeared from view, her fingers tracing her lips where the memory of his kiss lingered like a promise, or perhaps a challenge. Whatever had awakened between them in that rain-drenched alcove couldn't be easily dismissed, despite Caleb's attempt to retreat behind the safety of their working relationship. Something fundamental had shifted, like the desert landscapes transformed by rainfall. What grew from that transformation remained to be seen, but Eliza knew with certainty that neither of them could pretend the ground beneath their feet was the same as before the storm. As darkness settled over Willow Creek Ranch, she touched the locket at her throat, thinking of covenants made and kept, of water finding its way through hidden channels, of patience rewarded after long drought. Perhaps Two Hawks was right. Some things were worth waiting for, their value measured not in immediate gain but in the fullness of time. Tomorrow would come, bringing Caleb back to her door with the rising sun. What happened next would depend on courage, hers to pursue what her heart increasingly desired, his to overcome whatever held him back from accepting what grew between them. For tonight, the memory of his kiss was enough. A first taste of connection sweeter than any she'd known, promising depths yet to be explored when the time was right. Drought and desire. The late June sun beat down mercilessly as Eliza knelt beside the newly dug irrigation channel, tamping soil around a young tomato plant. A week had passed since the storm, since the kiss that neither she nor Caleb had directly mentioned, though its memory lingered between them like a shared secret. "Those need more water at the base," Caleb called from where he was reinforcing the main channel with flat stones. "Tomatoes drink like a miner on payday." "You're the expert," Eliza replied, wiping perspiration from her forehead with her sleeve, "though I still think 12 plants is excessive for one woman." "You won't be saying that come harvest." He straightened, surveying their morning's work with quiet satisfaction. "Besides, excess means trade goods. Mrs. Rodriguez already promised to swap chilies for tomatoes." Eliza sat back on her heels, taking a moment to admire what they'd accomplished in a single week. The storm had provided the impetus for implementing irrigation plans they'd discussed for days. With the ground softened by rainfall, they had dug channels leading from a small, concealed spring outlet, not the main sacred pool, but a minor seep Caleb assured her the Apache had approved for agricultural use. The result was a garden plot that seemed to flourish before her eyes, sprouting corn, beans, squash, and a variety of vegetables that Mrs. Sanchez had assured her would thrive in the desert climate with proper tending. Around it, stones had been arranged in careful patterns that would direct runoff from future rains toward the thirstier plants. "You've created a small miracle here," she said, genuine admiration in her voice. "We've created it," Caleb corrected, coming to stand beside her. "You're a quick study." "I have a determined teacher." Eliza smiled up at him, enjoying the brief flash of pleasure that crossed his features before he schooled his expression. Since the kiss, such moments had become more frequent. Brief exchanges where the careful boundaries they maintained slipped, revealing deeper currents beneath their working relationship. A lingering glance, a touch that lasted a heartbeat too long when passing tools. The way his voice sometimes dropped to a lower register when they worked in close proximity. Eliza treasured these small tells, evidence that she wasn't alone in feeling the pull between them. The Rodriguez brothers should arrive soon with the adobe for patching your south wall, Caleb said, retreating to safer topics. You'll be watertight before the summer storms hit in earnest. The rehabilitation of her cabin had proceeded alongside the garden's development. Each day brought new improvements, a reinforced roof, replastered walls, repaired floorboards that no longer threatened to send her plunging into the crawl space below. Eliza's small inheritance was dwindling faster than she'd anticipated, but the results justified every penny. Perhaps I should have hired a proper construction crew from town, she teased, knowing his opinion on the matter. And receive inferior work at triple the cost? No thank you. Caleb's disdain for Mesquite Springs building standards was a recurring theme. Miguel and Jesus Rodriguez know more about desert construction than any 10 carpenters from back east. I'm joking, she assured him, rising to her feet and brushing dirt from her skirts. She'd abandoned proper Eastern attire weeks ago in favor of a practical split skirt Mrs. Sanchez had helped her fashion, paired with a simple blouse that allowed freedom of movement. Their work is excellent, and their company a welcome change from your endless lectures on proper irrigation slopes. His mouth quirked in that almost smile she'd come to cherish. My lectures are thorough, not endless. 6 separate discussions on the optimal angle for water flow suggests otherwise, Professor Thornton. 5 discussions and 1 practical demonstration, he corrected, the amber of his eyes warming with amusement. Which you requested, if memory serves. This easy banter had developed alongside their working routine, a comfortable rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Yet beneath it lay the unspoken awareness of what had passed between them during the storm, a current of possibility neither seemed quite ready to navigate. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Eliza turned, expecting to see the Rodriguez brothers with their wagon of supplies. Instead, she found herself facing 4 riders. Miguel and Jesus Rodriguez as anticipated, but accompanied by an older man and a young woman Eliza hadn't met before. "Signor Thornton, Signorita Hargrove," Miguel called in greeting as they approached. "I hope we do not intrude. My father and sister asked to come." Caleb nodded in recognition to the older man. "Signor Rodriguez, it's been some time." "Too long," the patriarch agreed, dismounting with the dignity of his years. Though his hair was silver and his face deeply lined, he carried himself with the straight-backed pride of a man accustomed to hard work. "We heard of your water-sharing plan. I wished to see for myself." "Of course," Eliza said, stepping forward to welcome them. "I'm Eliza Hargrove. My uncle spoke highly of your family in his journals." "Ezekiel was a man of honor," Signor Rodriguez replied, inclining his head. "When my sons told me his niece carries on his traditions, I could scarcely believe it. But now I see with my own eyes." His gaze moved appreciatively over the developing garden and repaired structures. "You have done much in little time." "With considerable help," Eliza acknowledged, gesturing toward Caleb and the Rodriguez brothers, who were already unloading adobe bricks from their wagon. "This is my daughter, Isabella," Signor Rodriguez continued, indicating the young woman who had remained mounted. Perhaps 18, with glossy black hair and delicate features, she regarded Eliza with undisguised curiosity. "She insisted on coming. The women in my family are determined." "A necessary quality on the frontier," Eliza replied with a smile. "Please join us for lunch after the men begin their work. I'd appreciate female company for a change." The morning merged into afternoon as work continued on multiple fronts. The Rodriguez brothers and Caleb tackled the cabin repairs, while Eliza showed Isabella and her father the irrigation system. When Senor Rodriguez expressed interest in implementing similar methods on his small farm, which had struggled through successive drought seasons, Eliza found herself explaining techniques she'd learned from Caleb with surprising confidence. "The water comes from a spring on your property?" Senor Rodriguez asked, studying the clever arrangement of channels. Partially, Eliza answered carefully, recalling Caleb's cautious approach to discussing the spring's precise location. It straddles the boundary between Willow Creek and Mr. Thornton's land. And you would share this water with Mexican farmers? The question held both surprise and wariness. Water sustains us all, Eliza replied, echoing Two Hawks' philosophy. My uncle understood that monopolizing it helps no one in the long term. Senor Rodriguez studied her thoughtfully. Montgomery has offered to buy our farm 3 times this year. Each time his price drops while his threats increase. What kind of threats? Eliza asked, alarmed. The kind that need no words, Isabella spoke for the first time, her English accented but precise. Men riding our boundaries at night, cattle accidentally breaking fences and trampling crops, a mysterious fire in our storage shed. That's outrageous, Eliza said, anger rising at Montgomery's tactics. Have you reported these incidents to the sheriff? Father and daughter exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their expectations of justice. Sheriff Pickens dines at Montgomery's table twice weekly, Senor Rodriguez said simply. Our complaints find no ears there. The bitter reality of their situation struck Eliza forcefully. Her own position as a woman facing Montgomery's ambitions was precarious enough, but at least her skin color and family name afforded her certain protections. The Rodriguez family faced an additional barrier of prejudice that rendered their grievances essentially invisible to local authorities. What if we formed an alliance, she suggested, the idea taking shape as she spoke. Your family has farming expertise I sorely lack. I have water access you need. Together, we might create something resilient enough to withstand Montgomery's pressure. Isabella's eyes widened. You would partner with Mexicans openly? I would partner with excellent farmers who treat the land with respect, Eliza corrected. Your nationality is irrelevant to the question of water and crops. Senor Rodriguez regarded her with renewed interest. Truly, your uncle's blood runs in your veins, Señorita Hargrove. He spoke similarly when others refused to sell goods to Mexican families during the border conflicts. Then we understand each other, Eliza said, extending her hand in the masculine gesture of agreement, before remembering it might not be appropriate across cultural lines. To her relief, Senor Rodriguez clasped it firmly. We shall discuss terms, he agreed, after we have broken bread together. The impromptu gathering around Eliza's table that afternoon had a festive quality that belied the serious nature of their discussions. Mrs. Sanchez, arriving midday with fresh tortillas and a pot of beans, embraced Senor Rodriguez as an old friend and immediately set about expanding the meal to accommodate the additional guests. The women chattered in rapid Spanish while preparing food, with Isabella occasionally translating comments she thought might interest Eliza. Watching from the doorway as Caleb explained a fine point of adobe application to the Rodriguez brothers, Eliza felt a curious sense of rightness settle over her. This gathering of disparate individuals, united by common purpose rather than social standing or background, represented something she'd never experienced in Boston's rigidly stratified society. He watches you when you are not looking, Isabella murmured, appearing at Eliza's elbow with a knowing smile. And you watch him the same way. Heat climbed Eliza's cheeks. Mr. Thornton and I have a business arrangement, she said primly, falling back on Boston propriety. Isabella's laugh was like silver bells. Of course, just business. That explains why he nearly breaks his neck turning to find you whenever you move out of his sight. You're imagining things, Eliza protested, though a small thrill ran through her at the suggestion. I imagine nothing. I have eyes. Isabella tied an apron around her slim waist, preparing to help with lunch. But I understand. Some things grow better in shadow than in full sun. She winked conspiratorially before returning to help her father set out plates. The meal passed pleasantly, with conversation flowing more easily than Eliza might have expected given the diverse backgrounds around her table. Plans for water sharing were discussed in practical terms, with Caleb offering technical suggestions while carefully avoiding any mention of the sacred spring's exact location. By the time dessert, Mrs. Sanchez's honey-drizzled sopapillas was served, a tentative agreement had been reached. The Rodriguez family would provide agricultural expertise and labor in exchange for controlled water access through the irrigation system, Harvests would be shared proportionally with surplus stored communally against future drought. Most significantly, they would stand together against outside pressure, presenting a united front to Montgomery's divide-and-conquer tactics. "It is a beginning," Señor Rodriguez declared, satisfaction evident in his weathered features. "Others will join when they see it can work. Or when Montgomery squeezes them hard enough," Jesus added with youthful cynicism. "Either way, we'll be ready," Caleb said, his quiet confidence bolstering Eliza's resolve. As the afternoon waned and their guests prepared to depart, Eliza found herself filled with unexpected optimism. What had begun as a simple garden plot had expanded into something more significant, the seed of a community bound by mutual need and respect, rather than circumstance or convention. "We return tomorrow to finish the wall," Miguel promised as they loaded their wagon, "and perhaps bring Pablo Suarez and his sons to discuss joining our arrangement. Their well runs dry 3 months each year." "You're welcome any time," Eliza assured him, touched by their eagerness to expand the alliance. She stood on the porch watching them depart, Caleb a solid presence beside her. When his hand brushed hers, fingers momentarily entwining before separating, the contact sent warmth spiraling through her despite the day's heat. "You've started something significant," he observed, his voice pitched low for her ears alone. Ezekiel would be proud. "We've started it," she corrected, turning to meet his gaze directly. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Something flickered in his amber eyes. An emotion quickly shuddered. "You'd have found a way." "You're more capable than you realize." Before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention once more. Eliza sighed, wondering if the Rodriguez family had forgotten something. But the riders who appeared around the bend in her drive bore no resemblance to her recent guests. James Montgomery led the group, immaculate as always in tailored clothing that somehow remained pristine despite the dusty journey. Behind him rode 3 men Eliza didn't recognize, one carrying surveying equipment that immediately raised her suspicions. "Trouble," Caleb muttered, his posture subtly shifting to place himself slightly ahead of her on the porch steps. "Miss Hargrove," Montgomery called as they approached, his smile as perfect and cold as carved ice. "What a charming domestic scene. I see you're entertaining the local peasantry now." The deliberate insult to the Rodriguez family stoked immediate anger in Eliza's breast. "Mr. Montgomery, had I known you were calling, I'd have set an extra place for lunch, though I doubt our simple fare would satisfy your refined tastes." His smile didn't waver, but something dangerous flickered in his pale eyes. "Your hospitality is noted, but I come on business." He gestured to the man with the surveying equipment. "This is Mr. Walters, county surveyor. He's been reviewing the original property boundaries in this section." Caleb's stance had gone rigid, though his expression revealed nothing. "Is that so?" "Interesting timing, considering the recent developments at Willow Creek. Pure coincidence, I assure you." Montgomery's tone suggested anything but. "Mr. Walters, please explain your findings to Miss Hargrove." The surveyor, a thin man with nervous hands, cleared his throat. "Yes, well, upon examination of the original Spanish land grants and subsequent American territorial surveys, it appears there may be a discrepancy in the northern boundary of Willow Creek Ranch." Eliza's stomach tightened. "What kind of discrepancy?" "The boundary marker appears to have been moved approximately 300 yards south of its original position at some point in the past 20 years, Walters explained, producing a map from his satchel. "According to the original survey conducted in 1851, the true boundary should follow this ridge line." He indicated a line that would place the sacred spring squarely on what was now Montgomery's property. "That's absurd," Caleb interjected, his voice deceptively calm. "The boundary markers have been in their current position since before the war. Ezekiel Hargrove and Nathaniel Montgomery, your father," he added, glancing at James, "agreed on those boundaries in 1853. "A verbal agreement, perhaps," Montgomery conceded with a dismissive wave. "But the official surveys tell a different story. Mr. Walters has filed his findings with the Territorial Land Office." "How convenient that this discovery occurs just when Miss Hargrove begins developing water resources," Caleb observed, the edge in his voice unmistakable. Montgomery's smile thinned. "The timing is fortuitous, I admit, But the law is the law, Thornton. You, of all people, should appreciate that, given your former profession. The barb struck home. Eliza saw it in the tightening of Caleb's jaw. But his response surprised her. I do appreciate the law, Montgomery, including statutes regarding adverse possession and established usage rights. The words emerged with the precision of a man accustomed to legal argument. Ezekiel Hargrove maintained and utilized that northern section continuously for over 20 years without contest. Under territorial statutes adopted in 1863, that established a legal claim superseding original survey markers. Montgomery's confidence faltered visibly. That's hardly, furthermore, Caleb continued, warming to his subject, the Smith v. Jefferson decision of 1869 specifically addressed boundary disputes based on resurveys after long-established usage. The territorial court ruled that where mutual acceptance of boundaries has governed neighboring landowners' conduct over a period exceeding 15 years, such boundaries acquire the force of legal recognition absent evidence of deliberate fraud. The transformation was remarkable. Gone was the taciturn rancher, replaced by a man wielding legal precedent like a finely honed blade. Eliza watched in fascination as Montgomery's smug certainty crumbled beneath this unexpected counterattack. You've been practicing law without a license, Thornton, Montgomery finally managed, his attempt at humor falling flat. Simply stating facts, Caleb replied evenly. Facts I suspect you were hoping Miss Hargrove wouldn't know. Montgomery's gaze shifted to Eliza, reassessing her with calculation evident in his cold eyes. Miss Hargrove, despite Thornton's legal theatrics, the situation remains clear. That northern section, including the water source you've been developing, legally belongs to Circle M Ranch. I find that difficult to accept given Mr. Thornton's explanation, Eliza replied, grateful her voice remained steady despite her racing heart. Perhaps we should consult an independent attorney before proceeding further. By all means, Montgomery agreed with false graciousness. Though I should warn you that challenging a certified survey in territorial court is an expensive proposition. I understand your finances are limited. The thinly veiled threat hung in the air. Montgomery was right. She couldn't afford a protracted legal battle, and he knew it. Yet surrendering the spring would not only cripple her fledgling alliance with the Apache. I'll consider my options, she said carefully, unwilling to reveal her distress. Montgomery smiled, sensing victory. I'll expect your decision within the week. After that, I'll be forced to file a formal complaint of trespass for any activity on the disputed land. He gathered his reins, preparing to depart. A word of advice, Miss Hargrove? This territory can be dangerous for stubborn women. Accidents happen with unfortunate frequency. Fires, snake bites, falls from horseback. A shame to risk such hazards over a mere property dispute. The threat, for all its elaborate dressing, was unmistakable. Eliza's blood ran cold, but she lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. How fortunate that I have neighbors who value my safety, Mr. Montgomery. I'm sure they would investigate any accident with particular thoroughness. His smile never wavered, but his eyes hardened to chips of ice. Good day, Miss Hargrove. Mr. Thornton, with a touch of his hat brim, he wheeled his horse and departed, his entourage falling in behind him like a well-trained cavalry unit. Eliza maintained her composure until they disappeared from view, then sagged against the porch post, trembling with reaction. The odious, despicable, careful, Caleb cautioned, though a ghost of a smile touched his lips. Ladies, don't use the words you're contemplating. Ladies haven't met James Montgomery, she retorted, earning a short bark of laughter from him despite the gravity of their situation. Come inside, he suggested, placing a steadying hand at the small of her back. We need to discuss this privately. In the relative cool of the cabin, Eliza paced while Caleb poured them each a cup of coffee, his movements deliberate as he gathered his thoughts. How much of what you said about the legal precedents was true? She asked, pausing to accept the steaming mug from his hands. All of it, he admitted, though I simplified considerably for Montgomery's benefit. The actual cases are more nuanced. You were impressive, she said softly. I begin to understand why your legal background disturbs Montgomery so much. You're a formidable opponent. A shadow crossed his features. I was, once. You still are. She touched his arm lightly. Your mind hasn't changed, only your circumstance. He didn't respond directly, instead moving to the window to scan the horizon with practiced vigilance. Montgomery won't give up easily. That survey ploy was just his opening move. What do you suggest? First, we document everything, the current boundary markers, your uncle's records of improvements to that section, any correspondence that references the property lines. Caleb's organizational mind was clearly at work. Then we consult Harrison in town. He's not much of a lawyer, but he can file the necessary paperwork to challenge the survey. And in the meantime, Eliza asked, recognizing there was more to his strategy. In the meantime, we're careful. His gaze met hers, serious and intent. Very careful. Montgomery's threat wasn't idle. Men have had accidents that crossed him before. A chill ran through her despite the afternoon heat. You believe he would actually... I believe he considers that spring worth almost any price. Caleb's expression hardened, especially now that word's spreading about your water-sharing arrangement with the Rodriguez family. You're threatening more than his expansion plans. You're challenging his control over the smaller ranchers and farmers. The full implication of Montgomery's animosity settled over Eliza like a physical weight. What had begun as a simple property dispute had escalated into something far more dangerous. Perhaps I should reconsider my position, she said reluctantly. If others might be harmed... Is that what Ezekiel would do? Caleb interrupted, his gaze intent. Surrender what's right because the fight might be difficult? The question pierced straight to her core. No, she admitted, he wouldn't. Neither will you. It wasn't a question, but a statement of absolute certainty that bolstered her wavering resolve. They stood in silence for a moment, the tension of Montgomery's visit gradually giving way to a different kind of awareness, of their proximity in the quiet cabin, of the trust implicit in their alliance, of the undercurrents that had flowed between them since that rain-drenched kiss neither had mentioned. I'll stay tonight, Caleb said abruptly, breaking the moment. Keep watch. Montgomery might decide to underscore his message. Propriety dictated she should refuse such an arrangement. An unmarried man spending the night at her home would set town tongues wagging faster than a windmill in a gale. But propriety seemed a distant concern compared to the very real threat Montgomery represented. I'd appreciate that, she said simply. As twilight approached, they settled into an oddly domestic routine. Caleb checked and secured doors and windows while Eliza prepared a simple dinner from the remaining lunch ingredients. They ate on the porch, watching the sunset paint the desert in lavish hues of gold and crimson, their conversation gradually shifting from Montgomery's threats to lighter topics. Mrs. Sanchez mentioned you've been asking her to teach you Spanish cooking, Caleb observed, accepting a second serving of beans with evident appreciation. I've discovered I prefer it to Boston cuisine, Eliza admitted, though my first attempt at chilies nearly burned through the pot. A common mistake. The heat builds more than you expect. His amber eyes crinkled at the corners. Like many things in desert living, the double meaning wasn't lost on her. Heat indeed built unexpectedly in cooking pots and in the growing awareness between them that neither seemed able to completely ignore despite their careful restraint. Caleb, she began hesitantly, about what happened during the storm. He set down his fork, expression suddenly guarded. You don't need to... I think I do. Eliza summoned her courage. We've been circling each other for days, pretending nothing changed, but it did, at least for me. The admission hung between them, vulnerable and honest in the gathering dusk. For a long moment, Caleb didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the darkening horizon as if seeking answers in the distance. It changed for me too, he finally said, his voice lower than usual. But that doesn't make it wise. Because of Montgomery? Because of who I am. What I am. His hand flexed unconsciously, drawing attention to his injured arm. A broken-down veteran with a scarred face and scarred soul isn't what you deserve, Eliza. Perhaps I'm capable of determining what I deserve, she countered, echoing words she'd spoken once before. You deserve better than half a man, he said with quiet finality. Is that truly how you see yourself? Eliza asked, genuinely pained by his self-assessment. Because it's not how I see you at all. Something vulnerable flickered across his features before he masked it. How do you see me, then? I see a man of intelligence and integrity, she said softly, a man who adapts rather than surrenders when faced with challenges, who taught himself new ways to work with one good arm rather than giving up, who uses his legal mind to protect others even while claiming he's left that life behind. She paused, gauging his reaction before continuing. I see a man who notices when I'm struggling but waits for me to ask for help rather than assuming I need it, who respects my decisions even when he disagrees with them, who kisses as if, she faltered, suddenly shy. As if what? He prompted, his voice rough-edged. As if I'm precious, she finished simply. Worth cherishing. The naked emotion that crossed his face before he looked away told Eliza her words had struck deep. They sat in charged silence as darkness settled fully around them, crickets taking up their nightly chorus in the surrounding scrubland. I should check the perimeter again, Caleb said finally, rising from his chair with the careful movements of a man whose body ached in old familiar ways. Make sure everything's secure for the night. Eliza recognized the retreat for what it was. Not rejection, but self-protection. Whatever barriers Caleb had erected around his heart hadn't been built in a day, and they wouldn't fall swiftly either. Of course, she said, gathering their empty plates. I'll make up a pallet in the main room for you. They moved through the evening's necessities with careful politeness, maintaining a physical distance that belied the emotional proximity of their earlier conversation. When Eliza retired to her bedroom, leaving Caleb to his vigil in the main room, the awareness of his presence just beyond her door kept sleep at bay, despite her exhaustion. In the darkest hour of night, she woke to the sound of quiet movement. Caleb making his rounds, she realized, checking windows and doors with soldier's vigilance. Through her partially open bedroom door, she caught a glimpse of him standing at the window, silhouetted against the starlit sky, his posture alert yet weary. In that unguarded moment, with silver moonlight casting his scarred profile in relief, he looked both stronger and more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him. A man carrying burdens visible and invisible, yet standing watch nonetheless. For her uncle's legacy, for principles that mattered more than personal comfort. The sight lodged in her heart like a physical ache. Whatever barriers separated them, his past, her future, Montgomery's threats, propriety's demands, seemed suddenly insubstantial compared to the simple truth of his presence in her life. Not half a man, as he so wrongly believed, but the most complete person she'd ever known. Morning would bring practical concerns back to the forefront, legal strategies against Montgomery's claims, precautions against his veiled threats, expansion of the water-sharing alliance. But for now, in the quiet sanctuary of darkness, Eliza allowed herself to acknowledge the deepening emotions she could no longer pretend were simply neighborly regard or physical attraction. She was falling in love with Caleb Thornton. Damaged arm, scarred face, reluctant heart, and all. The realization should have terrified her. A proper Boston lady wouldn't contemplate such feelings for a man society would deem unsuitable. But Eliza Hargrove was no longer that proper Boston lady. The desert had reshaped her as surely as it had carved the canyons that sheltered the sacred spring, gradually, persistently, creating something new from what had once been rigid and unyielding. Whether Caleb would ever allow himself to love her in return remained uncertain, but as she drifted back to sleep, comforted by his vigilant presence beyond her door, Eliza found herself remembering Two Hawk's words about the spring. Some things are worth protecting, even at great cost. Some things, indeed. Night descended over Willow Creek Ranch, wrapping the land in a velvet cloak studded with stars. Eliza sat on the porch steps, a shawl draped around her shoulders against the cooling air, watching as Caleb completed his final check of the property. Since his decision to stay the night, he'd maintained a vigil that blended caution with practicality, checking sightlines, securing entrances, even moving her horses to the smaller paddock with better visibility from the cabin. "All quiet?" he reported, settling beside her on the step. The evening breeze carried the scent of sage and cooling earth, along with the faint aroma of coffee from the cups she'd brought outside. No sign of Montgomery's men. Perhaps his threats were merely intimidation, Eliza suggested, passing him a steaming mug. Perhaps. Caleb's tone made it clear he placed little faith in that hope. Better to remain vigilant nonetheless. They sat in companionable silence for a time, sipping coffee and gazing at the impossibly vast sky. Out here, away from even the modest lights of Mesquite Springs, the stars appeared close enough to touch, blazing with an intensity never visible in Boston's smoke-dimmed skies. I loved the stars as a child, Eliza mused. Our governess taught us the constellations from books, but they never looked in life as they did in the illustrations. They look exactly as they should out here, Caleb replied, his gaze lifting toward the celestial panorama. Nothing between you and them but clear air. Something in his voice, a wistfulness perhaps, prompted her to ask, "Did you watch the stars as a boy in Texas?" He was quiet so long she thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice carried a distant quality, as if reaching back through layers of time. My father built a platform in our tallest oak. Said a man should have a place to contemplate the infinite. A soft sound that might have been a laugh escaped him. I think he really wanted somewhere to escape my mother's social obligations. They sound like interesting people, Eliza ventured, recognizing the rare glimpse into his past. They were. Caleb's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around his mug. My father built a respected law practice from nothing. Expected me to expand it after Harvard. He shook his head slightly. He didn't live to see me return from Gettysburg. Probably for the best. The quiet admission carried more weight than tears or a drama might have. Eliza resisted the urge to offer empty condolences, sensing he'd heard too many in his lifetime. Was it the arm that made you leave law behind? She asked instead, her directness born of growing understanding of this complex man. Partly. He set down his empty mug, his gaze fixed on the distant hills. A crippled lawyer raises questions about competence, no matter how sharp his mind remains. But it was more than that. Caleb fell silent again, and Eliza waited, recognizing his struggle to share what perhaps he'd never spoken aloud. The weight of unsaid words hung between them, tangible as the night air. I had a wife, he finally continued, the words emerging with careful control. Sarah, and a son, William. They stayed with her family in Pennsylvania while I was fighting. Safer there, we thought, away from the Texas conflicts. Eliza's heart contracted, already sensing the trajectory of his story. And they... Typhoid, he said simply. The letter reached me the day before Gettysburg. I went into battle knowing they were already gone. His voice remained steady, but his hand, the injured one, flexed unconsciously against his thigh. The rebel bayonet that took my arm almost seemed a mercy. Physical pain was easier. The stark simplicity of his confession struck Eliza more powerfully than elaborate grief might have. This man, who moved through each decay with quiet competence despite his injury, carried a wound far deeper than the visible scar tissue. "I'm so sorry, Caleb," she said softly, the inadequacy of the words painfully apparent. "It was a lifetime ago." He shrugged, the gesture betrayed by the tightness in his jaw. "The point is, I came west afterward because the law felt meaningless. Arguing property boundaries and contract disputes after watching men die for principles they believed in, it seemed hollow. Yet you defended my property today with legal precedence," Eliza observed. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Old habits, and Montgomery needed reminding he doesn't control everything with his money. "Including my stubborn adherence to my uncle's vision," she added, attempting to lighten the moment. His amber eyes, silvered by moonlight, met hers directly. "Your adherence to what's right, Eliza. That's your own vision, not just your uncle's." The simple affirmation touched her deeply. "Thank you for that. Few have seen me as more than an extension of my father's disgrace or my uncle's eccentric legacy." "Your father's disgrace?" Caleb prompted gently. Eliza realized she'd never shared the full story of her family's downfall, though he'd clearly heard rumors. Fair exchange, she thought, after his painful revelations. "My father lost everything in failed investments after the war," she began, her fingers plaiting the fabric of her skirt. Rather than face his creditors honestly, he embezzled funds to cover his losses. When discovery became inevitable, he took his own life. The memory still brought a flush of shame to her cheeks, not for the financial ruin, but for the cowardice of his final act. He left my mother and me to face not only poverty, but public humiliation. Society matrons who'd taken tea in our parlor for decades crossed streets to avoid speaking to us. Former friends became strangers overnight. "And your mother?" Caleb asked, his voice gentle. "Died 6 months later." Eliza swallowed against the tightness in her throat. "The doctor called it heart failure, but in truth, I believe it was a broken heart, not just for my father's death, but for the destruction of everything she'd built her identity upon, leaving you alone to bear the weight of it all." Not a question, but an understanding. "Yes." She lifted her chin, an unconscious gesture of defiance against old ghosts. "When my uncle's bequest arrived, it seemed like providence, a chance to rebuild far from whispers and sidelong glances. I never imagined I'd find—" She hesitated. "What?" he prompted. "Purpose," she said simply. "Connection to something larger than social standing or financial security." Their gazes held in the starlight, the shared vulnerability of their confessions creating an intimacy beyond physical proximity. Eliza became acutely aware of his nearness, the quiet strength of his presence beside her on the narrow porch step. "We're quite the pair," Caleb observed with soft irony. "Running from our pasts only to find ourselves defending a future neither of us planned." "Perhaps that's the nature of true purpose," Eliza suggested. "It finds us rather than the reverse." His scarred mouth curved in that rare smile that never failed to transform his features. "That sounds suspiciously like something two hawks would say." "I'm learning from many teachers out here." Her own smile answered his, a warmth building between them that had nothing to do with the coffee they'd shared. Caleb's expression sobered as he studied her face in the silver moonlight. "You've changed since you arrived, Eliza Hargrove. Grown into this land like you were meant for it all along." "Is that a compliment, coming from my demanding taskmaster?" she teased gently, though her heart quickened at the intensity of his gaze. "The highest," he affirmed quietly. Something shifted in the air between them, the careful distance they'd maintained since the storm giving way to the inexorable pull they'd both been fighting. When Caleb's hand rose to brush a strand of hair from her cheek, the simple touch sent awareness cascading through her. "Eliza," he murmured, her name carrying questions he couldn't seem to voice. She answered by leaning into his touch, her eyes holding his in silent invitation. For a heartbeat he hesitated, the same caution she'd seen when they'd sheltered from the storm. Then, as if a decision had been reached, he closed the distance between them. This kiss held none of the surprise of their first encounter. It began gently, almost reverently, his lips brushing hers with careful restraint. But when Eliza's hands rose to his shoulders, fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt, the tenuous hold on his control slipped. With a sound low in his throat, Caleb deepened the kiss, his good arm encircling her waist to draw her closer. Eliza responded with equal fervor, months of denied awareness flaring into undeniable heat. His mouth moved over hers with increasing urgency, teaching her responses she'd never imagined in her sheltered Boston upbringing. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unevenly, the look in his amber eyes sent a thrill of anticipation through her, heat tempered with tenderness, desire held in check by something deeper. "We should go inside," he suggested, voice rough-edged. "The night air is cooling." The practical observation made her smile despite the racing of her heart. "Always the voice of reason, Mr. Thornton." "Whom of us should be," he countered, but the glimmer in his eyes belied the solemnity of his tone. Inside the cabin, the single lamp cast golden light across the main room, creating islands of warmth amid elongated shadows. Caleb moved to stoke the banked fire, while Eliza gathered their empty cups, each seemingly intent on mundane tasks while acutely aware of the other's every movement. When she turned from placing the cups on the sideboard, she found him watching her, the firelight playing across the planes of his face, softening the scar that marked his cheek. "Second thoughts?" she asked softly, recognizing the conflict in his expression. "Not about wanting you," he answered with characteristic directness. "About what's right." Eliza crossed to him, stopping within arm's reach. "I'm not a girl needing protection from her own decisions, Caleb. I know my mind." And your heart? He challenged quietly. The question hung between them, demanding a truth she hadn't fully acknowledged, even to herself until this moment. My heart as well, she admitted, though I never expected to find it engaged in this wilderness. Something like wonder crossed his features, as if her confession had granted permission for his own carefully guarded feelings to surface. When he reached for her this time, it was with certainty rather than hesitation. Their bodies met in perfect accord, her softness yielding against his hardness as his mouth claimed hers with newfound confidence. Eliza wound her arms around his neck, pressing closer as his kiss deepened, his tongue tracing the seam of her lips until they parted on a sigh. The kiss evolved from tender exploration to mutual hunger, his hand tangling in her hair as hers mapped the broad expanse of his shoulders. When his lips left hers to trace a path along her jaw to the sensitive hollow beneath her ear, Eliza gasped at the unfamiliar sensation. "Tell me to stop," Caleb murmured against her skin, his breath warm and enticing. "If this is too much, too fast—" "Don't stop," she whispered, tilting her head to grant him better access. "Please." The quiet plea seemed to unlock something within him. His good arm tightened around her waist, drawing her flesh against him as his mouth returned to hers with renewed fervor. Eliza melted into the embrace, every nerve ending alive to his touch as he guided her toward the settle near the hearth. They sank onto it together, her skirts billowing around them as he drew her half across his lap. The new position brought fresh awareness of his strength, the solid warmth of him beneath her palms as they slid across his chest. "You're beautiful," he murmured, his voice roughened with desire as he traced the curve of her cheek with gentle fingers. "So beautiful it hurts to look at you sometimes." The naked honesty of his admission touched Eliza deeply. This man, who measured words as carefully as water in drought, offering such vulnerability, humbled her. "Even with prairie dust in my hair and calluses on my hands?" she asked, attempting lightness despite the emotion tightening her throat. "Especially then." His amber eyes held hers, serious despite the smile tugging at his mouth. "When you're most yourself." Their lips met again, the kiss deepening as his hand slid from her waist to her hip, fingers playing possessively against the curve. Eliza leaned into his touch, her own hands growing bolder as they explored the breadth of his shoulders, the solid muscle of his chest beneath his shirt. When his mouth left hers to trail heated kisses down the column of her throat, she gasped at the unfamiliar pleasure. His lips found the sensitive hollow where her neck met her shoulder, lingering with exquisite attention until she trembled against him. "Caleb," she breathed, his name a plea for something she couldn't articulate. He understood nonetheless. His hand rose to the buttons at her throat, hesitating until she nodded her permission. With painstaking care, he unfastened the top buttons of her blouse, revealing the delicate skin beneath to his appreciative gaze. "Like moonlight on water," he murmured, bending to press his lips to the newly exposed curve of her collarbone. Eliza's head fell back on a sigh as sensation cascaded through her. His mouth traced a path along the edge of her chemise, careful to maintain propriety, even in passion. Yet the restraint only heightened her response, each carefully placed kiss stoking the fire building low in her belly. Her hands, gaining courage from his obvious appreciation, ventured to the buttons of his shirt. She fumbled slightly in her inexperience, but his patience never wavered as she parted the fabric to reveal tanned skin marked with scars of varying vintages. The most prominent, a jagged line across his left shoulder, where surgeon's stitches had closed the wound that cost him full use of his arm. Eliza traced the scar with gentle fingertips, feeling him tense beneath her touch. "Does it pain you still?" "Not your touch," he answered, his voice husky with emotion and desire. "Never your touch." The simple assurance freed her to explore further, her palms gliding over the warm skin of his chest, marveling at the contrasts of soft hair and hard muscle beneath. When her fingers accidentally brushed across his nipple, his sharp intake of breath and the sudden tightening of his arm around her waist revealed the effect of her innocent exploration. Emboldened, she bent to press her lips to his collarbone, mimicking his earlier attentions. The taste of him, salt and sage and something uniquely male, sent a thrill through her that bordered on scandalous. Caleb's response was immediate, a low groan escaping him as his hand tangled in her hair, guiding her mouth back to his for a kiss that stole her breath with its intensity. Time lost meaning as they learned each other with increasing intimacy. His hand skimmed her side, thumb brushing the underside of her breast through the fabric of her blouse, drawing a soft moan from her lips that seemed to inflame him further. When he finally cupped the gentle weight in his palm, the sensation was so exquisite that Eliza arched against him, seeking closer contact. "You undo me," he confessed against her lips, voice strained with the effort of restraint. "I never thought to feel this way again." The vulnerability in his admission reached beyond physical desire to something profound, a man who believed himself broken, finding wholeness in her arms. Eliza framed his face between her palms, thumbs tracing the strong line of his jaw, including the scar that marked him. "And you remake me," she whispered, "into someone stronger than I knew I could be." Their gazes held, communicating without words the depth of feeling neither was quite ready to name. When they kissed again, it carried the weight of that unspoken recognition, tender yet passionate, gentle yet demanding. Caleb's hand continued its careful exploration, learning the curves and hollows of her body through the increasingly frustrating barrier of clothing. When his fingers found the sensitive peak of her breast, even through layers of fabric, the pleasure was so acute that Eliza gasped against his mouth, her body instinctively pressing closer. The sound of her response seemed to pierce the haze of desire enveloping them. Caleb stilled, his breathing ragged as he pressed his forehead against hers. "We need to stop," he said, the words clearly costing him before we go too far. Frustration and relief warred within Eliza, her body protesting even as her mind acknowledged the wisdom of his restraint. "I don't want to stop," she admitted honestly. "Nor do I." His smile held rueful acknowledgement of their shared predicament. "But I won't dishonor you, Eliza. Not when you've already lost so much to preserve your good name." The consideration touched her deeply, especially knowing the cost to his own desires. "You're a good man, Caleb Thornton," she said softly. "Better than you believe yourself to be." His expression softened with an emotion that might have been love, had either of them been brave enough to name it. "And you're a woman worth waiting for, Eliza Hargrove." They remained entwined for long moments, neither quite willing to surrender the intimacy they'd found. Gradually, reluctantly, they restored order to their clothing, though Caleb's arm remained around her waist as they sat before the fire, her head resting against his shoulder. "What happens now?" she asked, the question encompassing far more than the immediate future. "Now, I keep watch while you get some sleep," he answered, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Tomorrow we face Montgomery's threats together." "And us?" The question emerged before she could reconsider its wisdom. Caleb's arm tightened slightly around her. "One step at a time," he said gently, "but together, if that's what you want." "It is," she affirmed, certainty filling her despite the complications such a choice entailed. Whatever grew between them would face obstacles. Montgomery's enmity, society's judgment, perhaps even their own doubts. Yet, sitting in the circle of his arm, watching firelight dance across the hearth, Eliza couldn't imagine choosing differently. The crack of gunfire jerked Eliza from deep sleep, her heart pounding as she struggled to orient herself in the darkness. A second shot galvanized her into action. She fumbled for her wrapper, throwing it around her nightgown as she rushed from the bedroom. The main room stood empty, Caleb's pallet abandoned, the front door standing open. Through the window, a hellish orange glow illuminated the night. Fire, she realized with dawning horror, in the direction of the corral. "Caleb!" she called, fear clutching her heart as she ran onto the porch. The scene before her sent ice through her veins, despite the heat radiating across the yard. Flames engulfed the corral's far side, racing up support posts with hungry intensity. Dark figures moved against the inferno. Caleb wrestling with a man near the water trough while another figure fled toward the shadows, gunfire tracking his retreat. Without conscious thought, Eliza grabbed the bucket kept by the porch steps and raced to the well pump. Her arms protested as she worked the handle, muscles burning from previous day's labor, but desperation lent her strength. Water gushed into the bucket, precious seconds ticking by as it filled. By the time she reached the corral, Caleb had subdued his opponent, binding the man's hands with a length of rope. "Stay back," he shouted when he spotted her. "The fire's spreading," she countered, already flinging water onto the nearest burning post. A curse escaped him. Whether at the fire or her defiance, she couldn't tell. "The horses," he ordered, securing his prisoner to a fence post well away from the flames. "Get them out first." Understanding flashed through her. The terrified whinnies piercing the night reminded her that lives, not just structures, hung in the balance. She abandoned the bucket, racing to the paddock gate where wide-eyed equines stamped and circled in panic. Together they worked with frantic efficiency, Caleb breaking the gate's latch when the metal proved too hot to touch normally. Eliza caught bridles and led trembling horses to the relative safety of the open yard, while Caleb returned to fight the blaze, using wet gunny sacks to beat at the flames. Time lost meaning in the desperate struggle. Eliza worked until her arms felt leaden, carrying buckets, soaking sacks, listening for the crack of weakening timbers over the fire's roar. Sweat streamed down her face, mingling with tears of exertion and fear that she couldn't afford to acknowledge. When the last flames finally sputtered into smoky submission, nearly half the corral stood charred beyond salvation. But the connected barn had been spared, and no animals had been lost to the blaze. Eliza sagged against the water trough, suddenly aware of trembling muscles and stinging lungs. Caleb didn't look much better. Face streaked with soot, shirt torn at the shoulder, a bloody scrape across his cheekbone where his opponent had landed. He knelt beside her, concern evident in his exhausted features. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, eyes scanning for injuries. Eliza shook her head, unable to summon words past the tightness in her throat. The reality of what they'd barely escaped pressed upon her, not just the loss of structures, but the deliberate malice behind the attack. Sleep-fogged memory crystallized with sudden clarity. "There was gunfire," she managed. "Before the fire. Warning shots," Caleb confirmed grimly. "Meant to draw me out while they set the blaze. 3 men, at least." "Montgomery's men?" The question hardly needed asking. "Our friend here isn't talking." Caleb nodded toward their captive, a nondescript man in dusty range clothes who glared at them from beneath the brim of a filthy hat. But the timing's hardly coincidental. Eliza's gaze swept over the destruction. Charred timbers still smoking against the night sky, water pooling in muddy patches where they'd fought the flames, horses huddled together in nervous proximity. The attack represented more than mere vandalism. It was a declaration of war. "He's escalating," she said softly, the implications chilling her despite the lingering heat. "This could have killed us if you hadn't been on watch." "That was likely the point." Caleb's voice held a calm she suspected masked cold fury, a warning that becomes tragedy if unheeded. "I won't be frightened away," Eliza declared, straightening despite her exhaustion. "Not from my land, not from the spring, not from what we're building here." Something kindled in Caleb's amber eyes as they met hers. Pride, determination, and something deeper that made her heart quicken despite their dire circumstances. "We," he repeated, the single word carrying significant weight. "Yes, we," she affirmed, reaching for his hand despite their audience. "I'm not fighting for just a ranch anymore, Caleb. I think you know that." His fingers tightened around hers, soot-stained and water-wrinkled from their labors. "I know," he said simply. The admission, unadorned by elaboration, spoke volumes about his own shifting priorities. A sound from the darkness drew their attention, hoofbeats approaching at measured pace rather than the gallop of attackers returning. They tensed, Caleb reaching for the rifle propped against the water trough, but relaxed when a familiar figure emerged from the shadows. 2 hawks sat astride a paint pony, his aging face lined with concern as he surveyed the damage. "I saw the fire from the ridge," he explained, dismounting with the fluid grace that belied his years. "Came as quickly as these old bones allowed." "You're a welcome sight nonetheless," Caleb said, clasping the elder's forearm in greeting. 2 hawks studied their bedraggled appearance, his dark eyes taking in details with shrewd assessment. "The water stealer's work," he stated rather than asked, nodding toward their captive. "Montgomery," Elizo confirmed, "though proving it may be difficult. Proof matters for white man's law, not for truth." 2 hawks turned his attention to the prisoner, studying him with such intensity that the man shifted uncomfortably despite his bonds. This one will speak when proper questions are asked. Caleb's eyebrows rose. You have experience with interrogation? A smile flickered across the Apache elder's weathered face. I have experience with fear, and this one, he nodded toward their captive, carries fear in his eyes, not of you, but of the one who sent him. Montgomery, Eliza guessed. The one who has been asking questions about the sacred spring, Two Hawks confirmed. My hunters have seen his men watching the canyons, following game trails, searching for paths to the water. The revelation sent a chill through Eliza, despite the night's lingering warmth. He knows the spring exists, but not exactly where. He seeks, but does not find. Two Hawks' expression grew grave. But he offers gold to those who might betray its location. Some among the people grow hungry as game dwindles. Hunger makes even the faithful consider betrayal. So we're fighting on two fronts, Caleb said grimly. Legal challenges to the property line and direct threats to the spring itself. 3 fronts, Eliza corrected, gesturing toward the smoldering corral. Don't forget physical intimidation. 4. Two Hawks' quiet addition drew their attention. The water sharing you begin with the Mexican families. This threatens Montgomery's control more than any boundary dispute. If small ranchers no longer depend on his good graces for water access during drought, they are no longer beholden to him, Eliza finished, understanding dawning. Our alliance undermines his power in the entire valley, which makes you more dangerous than your uncle ever was, Caleb added, his expression torn between pride and concern. Ezekiel protected the spring but kept largely to himself. You're building community around it. The weight of this recognition settled on Eliza's shoulders, not just the danger it represented, but the responsibility. What had begun as a simple desire to honor her uncle's legacy had evolved into something far more significant. The choices she made now would affect not just herself, but the families who had begun to align themselves with Willow Creek Ranch. So, what do we do? She asked, looking between Caleb and Two Hawks. We protect what matters, Caleb answered without hesitation. The spring, the ranch, the alliance you've started, and each other, Eliza added softly, her gaze holding his. Each other, he agreed, the simple phrase carrying deeper meaning than mere words could convey. Two Hawks observed their exchange with knowing eyes. The fire that threatens also forges, he commented, glancing meaningfully at their still joined hands. Some bonds grow stronger in danger's heat. Heat that had nothing to do with the dying fire rose in Eliza's cheeks, but she didn't withdraw her hand from Caleb's. Let the elders see the truth between them. It was hardly the most pressing concern they faced. We need a plan, she said, steering conversation back to practical matters. Montgomery won't stop with one failed attack. No, he will strike again, Two Hawks agreed. But not tonight. The jackal retreats to consider new methods when the first fails. Giving us time to prepare, Caleb said, his mind already working through possibilities. We'll need help. More than just the 3 of us can provide. The Rodriguez family, Eliza suggested, and perhaps others from their community who've expressed interest in the water-sharing alliance. My hunters can watch the canyons, Two Hawks offered. Ensure no one approaches the sacred pool unseen. As they discussed strategy in the pre-dawn darkness, Eliza felt something unexpected amid the fear and exhaustion. Hope, resilient as desert flowers after rainfall. They faced formidable opposition from a man with money, influence, and apparently few moral constraints. Yet standing amid the aftermath of destruction, soot-stained and weary but unbowed, she sensed a strength in their unlikely alliance that Montgomery, for all his resources, lacked. The eastern sky had begun to lighten, night reluctantly yielding to approaching dawn, when they finalized their immediate plans. Two Hawks would return to his people, organizing watches over the canyon approaches. Caleb would ride to the Rodriguez farm at first light, bringing news of the attack and recruiting assistance for rebuilding. Eliza would question their prisoner with the sheriff once the man could be convinced to respond to her summons. As Two Hawks mounted his pony, preparing to depart, he paused to fix Eliza with his penetrating gaze. Water finds its path through stone, he said, his voice carrying the weight of generations. Patient, persistent, unyielding. Be as water, daughter of Ezekiel. The blessing, for so it felt, warmed her despite her exhaustion. I will try to be worthy of the trust, she replied with equal solemnity. When the elder had disappeared into the lightning landscape, Eliza turned to find Caleb watching her with an expression that made her heart stumble, despite their dire circumstances. What? She asked, suddenly self-conscious of her disheveled appearance, nightgown and wrapper beneath a hastily donned coat, hair tumbling from its braid, face streaked with soot and sweat. I was just thinking Two Hawks is right, Caleb said softly. You are like water, finding your way past every obstacle, nurturing what you touch, stronger than you appear. The unexpected poetry from this usually taciturn man touched Eliza deeply. I've had examples of strength to follow, she replied, her gaze holding his meaningfully. They stood amid the destruction wrought by malice, surrounded by evidence of how quickly safety could be threatened, yet Eliza felt strangely at peace. Whatever came next. Montgomery's continued attacks, the challenges of rebuilding, the complications of their deepening relationship. They would face it together. As the first rays of sunrise gilded the eastern hills, turning charred timber to gold and transmuting muddy puddles to mirrors of light, Eliza Hargrove made a silent vow. This land, this water, this fragile community taking root in hostile soil, she would protect it all, not just for her uncle's legacy or even for her own future, but for the promise it represented in a territory where greed too often trumped compassion. And standing beside her in the new day's light, Caleb Thornton made a vow of his own, unspoken but no less binding. The woman who had awakened his heart from its long slumber would not stand alone against whatever storms approached, not while he had breath to draw and strength to lend. Together they watched the sunrise transform their world, finding beauty amid destruction, a fitting metaphor for the journey that had brought them to this moment and the path that stretched before them still.